In the gilded grand hall, Claudia Vexler cast a scornful glance. A black kid, the maid's son, dares to touch my chessboard. Your whole life's purpose is to mop floors. Laughter erupted in agreement. Wine glasses raised high as if to toast the humiliation. Ruth Johnson was stunned and silent, her hands trembling. But Caleb Johnson lifted his head, his voice firm. I don't play to make you laugh. I play to make you silent. Watch until the end, because you won't believe how a child so looked down upon could dismantle centuries of prejudice in just one game of chess. The grand hall of the luxury hotel gleamed with light. Crystal chandeliers hung down, scattering hundreds of streaks of brilliance like radiant halo. The sound of a violin flowed gently through the air, blending with the laughter of the wealthy as they raised glasses of amber-colored wine. Claudia Vexler stepped into the center of the room as if it were a stage built solely for her. Her face glowed with the smug confidence of someone who possessed vast wealth and a long list of powerful connections. Fawning greetings rang out from every direction. A few men bowing their heads low, a few women offering light laughter, all seemingly programmed to highlight Claudia's dominant presence in the scene. At the edge of the room, where the light barely reached, Ruth Johnson held a silver tray in her hand, her small figure modest and reserved. She tried to stay balanced. Footsteps glided past, the tray of wine trembling slightly, but her eyes never left a shadowed corner where Caleb Johnson stood. The boy was only 12 years old, dressed simply with a youth face, yet his gaze was unusually clear. Caleb stood still, nearly blending into the dark, avoiding the judging eyes of finely dressed guests. Ruth knew her son didn't belong here, and her heart clenched with every thought that one small mistake could turn his presence into a source of ridicule in the eyes of the powerful. Claudia didn't miss it. Her eyes swept across the room, past the rows of leather chairs and the gold-plated bar, and landed on where Caleb stood in the shadow. A smirk of contempt appeared on her lips. Her voice rang out, sharp and deliberate, loud enough for the entire hall to hear. Oh, the maid's son? Come here, we need a bit of fun. The invitation cut like a gilded knife, cold and humiliating. Ruth flinched, her whole body stiffening, the silver tray nearly slipping from her grasp. Caleb slowly lifted his head, his eyes meeting Claudia, and for a moment, the chandelier's glow lit his gaze like two silent blades. The entire room erupted in laughter. Whistles pierced the air, followed by jeering remarks. Yeah, let the kid try. Let's see if he knows anything besides cleaning. Some guests raised their wine glasses, swaying and laughing as if Claudia's words were the evening's main act. The stares fixed on Ruth and Caleb held no sympathy, only curiosity, condescension, and the thrill of witnessing public humiliation. Ruth felt the blood rush to her face, her heart pounding as she fought the urge to pull Caleb away immediately. But Claudia's footsteps rang out boldly, high heels striking the gleaming marble floor as she marched straight toward Caleb. In that moment, Ruth realized there was no way out. The entire room was watching, every gaze a spotlight, forcing her and her son to stand center stage, utterly unprepared. Claudia stopped in front of the mother and son, her eyes flashing with the delight of someone holding absolute control. She tilted her head, smiling lightly as if speaking to a well-trained pet. Why so frightened, Ruth? Let your boy come out and join us. Or are you hiding him like he's something special? Falsely sweet voice made Ruth shiver, while Caleb clenched his small fist, anxiety mixing with an oddly steady calm. Whispers rippled through the room. Some sighed in pity for the humiliation about to unfold, and others smiled in amusement at the scene Claudia had carefully set up. In the gleaming eyes of the crowd, Ruth saw only cruel delight. She knew without a doubt that she and her son had been dragged into a merciless joke, and Claudia was savoring every second of turning their presence into the evening's entertainment. Caleb looked around, saw his mother trembling, saw the mocking faces, Claudia's challenging stare. He took a deep breath, then stepped forward out of the shadow. The entire room fell silent for a few seconds, as if no one believed the boy would dare to move. Caleb did, and that single step unknowingly planted the seed for a moment no one in that lavish hall could have expected. In the dazzling light, amid harsh laughter and swirling contempt, the small child summoned as a prop became the center of the entire party. No one could have predicted from this moment on, the chessboard would cease to be a game and instead become a battlefield where intellect and truth stood ready to crush every illusion wrapped in power's glittering disguise. The sharp rhythm of Claudia Vexler's high heels echoed on the polished marble floor. She raised her hand, and two servers immediately rushed over, pulling from the corner a glossy, ebony chess table. The ivory pieces were arranged neatly, gleaming under the chandelier's warm glow. Everything unfolded quickly and seamlessly, as if the board had been prepared in advance, waiting for this exact moment to become a tool of humiliation. Once the board was placed at the center of the grand hall, the lights focused down, turning it into a stage where tonight's match play out not only in strategy, but in cruelty disguised as entertainment. Claudia clapped twice, each sound slicing through the air. She turned to Caleb with eyes full of contempt and said slowly, loud enough for all to hear, "Sit down. Let's see if your brain works for anything other than mopping floor." Each word landed like a hammer, crushing the fragile dignity Ruth tried to shield her son with. The room paused for half a beat, then burst into laughter. Sarcastic applause rang out like a chorus, wine rippling in raised glasses as the wealthy reveled in the spectacle of degradation. Ruth Johnson felt her knees begin to buckle. She set the tray on a nearby table, her hands clenched to steady the trembling. To her, Caleb was still just a child, still in need of protection from the cruelty of the world. She rushed forward, stepping in front of him, her voice unsteady with fear. "Please! He's just a boy. Don't turn him into a joke." But before she could finish, Claudia cut her off, raising a hand, her tone cold and flat. "Just one game, Ruth. If he loses, he goes back to washing dishes. If he wins, we'll call it a sweet little joke. I'll even let him take home a piece of cake." That mocking promise sparked louder laughter than before. The well-dressed crowd laughed until their faces turned red, and some clapped so hard their glasses rattled on the table. A man in a gray suit even muttered, "Yeah, let's see if the kid can tell a rook from a pawn." The laughter grew into a sharp, grating roar, bounced off the high ceiling and slammed into Ruth's ears like a warning bell of the humiliation to come. Caleb stood still, his eyes fixed on the board laid out in the center of the hall. Under the chandelier's glare, each piece seemed to shine with challenge, both unfamiliar and familiar. In that moment, he remembered the long night quietly spent at the old wooden table, where Ruth had scraped together every dollar to buy him a cheap plastic chess set. He recalled every move etched into memory, each strategy, each formation studied from worn books his mother found at the public library. And now, it all came back, clear and vivid, in the very room where the powerful used intellect not to uplift but to humiliate. Ruth placed her hand on her son's shoulder, her voice urgent. "Please don't. I don't want them to use you as a joke." But Caleb lifted his head, his eyes unusually bright, glowing with resolve. He said nothing, gently moved her hand aside, then walked out of the shadow, step by step. Under the weight of every gaze in the room, the boy moved toward the chessboard, small shoulders square, his posture upright, as if the weight of the entire hall couldn't make him bow. Claudia stepped back, pulled out a chair with the air of someone who had already won before the match began. She sat down, crossed her leg, her eyes narrowing like a cat watching its prey. Caleb drew the chair opposite. The scraping sound of wood against tile cut sharply through the tense air, thickening the atmosphere further. Guests around them closed in at once, the circle tightening, turning the board into the center stage where every eye was fixed. A cold female voice rang out from the back. "This is the most entertaining party I've ever attended. A live comedy show in a golden hall." Derisive laughter followed, glasses clinking together, and people beamed as if enjoying an expensive performance. To them, Caleb was not a child, and certainly not a contender. He was merely a prop, pushed into the spotlight to serve as backdrop for a cruel diversion. Claudia reached for a white, twirling it between her fingers before placing it on the board with a crisp click. She looked up at Caleb, her tone mocking. "Your move, little one. Show us what the cleaning class mind is capable of." A few chuckles slipped out, as if the whole room anticipated Caleb fumbling awkwardly, then being swiftly defeated, just to make their laughter more satisfying. Ruth clutched her chest, each heartbeat like a blade. She looked at her son facing down the powerful woman, surrounded by scorn, knowing every moment ahead would carve itself deep into his memory. What she didn't yet see was that Caleb was more ready than anyone in the room. He looked down at the board, gently touched a small pawn that mirrored himself, and in his eyes was no fear, only defiance. The laughter continued, glasses raised in celebration of a joke they assumed would end quickly. But somewhere beneath it all, a few began to sense something was off, because while Claudia sneered and Ruth silently begged, Caleb didn't tremble, didn't flinch. On the contrary, he sat upright, eyes focused, breath steady. He didn't look like a child dragged into a spectacle. He looked like a real player, waiting for the moment to begin the most important match of his life. The sound of a wooden baton striking the marble floor echoed through the banquet hall like a drumbeat, demanding silence. Officer Brandt emerged from the crowd, his broad frame in full police uniform causing the guests to part, making way for him. Every tap of the baton was deliberate, serving both as a warning and a display of power. When he stopped beside the chessboard, Brandt leaned down, his face close to Caleb, and his gravelly voice cut in, heavy with threat. "This kid thinks he's on the same level as the lady." The entire room watched, and the earlier laughter turned into murmurs of agreement. A few guests spoke up, stoking the tension. "That's right, someone needs to teach him his place." Brandt's presence, already oppressive, now weighed down on Ruth and Caleb like a wall closing in. Ruth stepped back, eyes wide with fear, staring at Brandt, sensing the injustice pulsing through every word and movement. movement. Claudia remained at ease in her chair, lips curled into a knowing smile. She spun a chess piece between her fingers, glanced at Brant, then back at Caleb. Her voice floated out, soft but mock. Let him play. I want to see this performance. It might be more fun than all the dull dancing tonight. Her words slipped into the ears of those nearby, drawing a few approving laughs, some nods of eager anticipation, all waiting to see the child crushed before their eyes. Caleb sat still, one hand resting gently on the table, his eyes locked on Claudia, then shifting to Brant. He took a long breath, then looked up, his voice clear and firm, stronger than his years. I'm not a joke. The words cut through the room, silencing a few laughs mid-sound. In that moment, the boy who had been dismissed became someone who stood upright in the storm, staring back at a sea of power without flinching. Brant squinted, his eyes flashing with threat like a beast provoked. He stepped closer, slamming the baton hard against the floor, the sound cracking like a gavel. His words came out in a low snarl, each syllable laced with venom. You'll regret lifting your head. The room seemed to freeze, the violin music fading into the distance like a forgotten echo. A few guests exchanged glances, waiting to see if Caleb would crumble under the pressure. Ruth felt her chest tighten, her entire body trembling. She wanted to pull her son close, drag him away from the chair across from Claudia, but her feet felt rooted to the floor. Brant's sharp stare told her clearly that any act of resistance would become another excuse to trample them further. In the harsh light, she saw her small son facing not just a chessboard, but an entire system of power pressing down on him all at once. Claudia smiled, tapping her fingers lightly on the ebony table. She looked like an eager spectator waiting for a scene she had directed. Making no effort to hide her delight, Brant used police authority to crush Caleb's confidence. All eyes turned to the boy, waiting for him to collapse, to see him tremble and flee so the spectacle could be complete. But Caleb remained still, back straight, gaze steady. He said nothing more, simply placed his small fingers on the white pawn, ready to make the first move. A wave of murmurs swept through the room, which now wavered between expectation and surprise. Some gritted their teeth, irritated by a child's defiance, while others began to sense that something different was quietly unfolding. In that oppressive atmosphere, Brant's words lingered like a curse, while Caleb's gaze glinted like a thin, shining blade, poised to strike at the wall of prejudice closing in around him. The tension spread, wrapping around Ruth's short breath and Claudia's cold stare. The game hadn't officially begun, but in this moment, a battle of power had already erupted. On one side stood the police and the wealthy elite, reveling in the privilege to impose. On the other hand was a small boy who dared to lift his head and face them. And in that exact moment, a quiet sense of disruption took root, a warning that this cruel performance might not unfold the way Claudia and Brant intended. Claudia Vexler leaned back in her chair, the chandelier's light catching the diamond on her finger as it touched the white piece. The room fell silent, with only the sound of wine swirling in glasses and Officer Brant's baton gently tapping the floor like the overture to a staged performance. Claudia lifted her pawn, smiling like someone already certain of victory. The first move landed with a sharp click on the polished ebony board. She looked up, her eyes sweeping the room, every expression radiating triumph, as if to say everything was already in her control. Caleb Johnson didn't shrink back or lower his gaze. He sat upright, his eyes clear and calm as he studied the board, his fingers resting lightly on a black pawn. A deep breath, then a smooth, firm push sent the piece forward. The sound was soft, but it startled more than a few in the room. It wasn't the impulsive move of a child playing by instinct, but the measured action of someone who knew real competition. Claudia's brow tightened, her eyes narrowing at the opposing piece, flicker of surprise crossing a face usually filled with confidence. A whisper rose from the back, loud enough to spread. "That's no child's play." The speaker was a guest in a dark suit, his eyes lighting up with the recognition of someone who had played the game for years. A few around him glanced over, then quickly turned their attention back to the board, their laughter now fading. The murmurs began to quiet, curiosity slipping in where mockery had just ruled. Officer Brant couldn't tolerate the silence. He stepped forward, slamming his baton hard on the floor, startling the entire room. His voice came down heavy like a shackle. "Don't let him think he's clever. This room will teach him his place." The words hit the air like a blunt strike, stirring another round of laughter, but it was different now, forced, half-hearted, as if somewhere inside a few had started to sense the joke wasn't going exactly the way Claudia had planned. Claudia pressed her lips together, masking her unease with a sharp laugh. She leaned back toward the board, adjusting her piece with deliberate focus, as if that alone could restore her edge. But just as she prepared to make her next move, her eyes met Caleb. It wasn't a fearful look, nor a pleading one. It was steady, bright, like a small light in a room full of shadow. That composure stripped Claudia of the control she always believed she held. Caleb said nothing, just observed, then placed his fingers neatly on a knight and moved it with precision. The play formed a mirrored position, leaving no room for arrogance. A few guests raised their eyebrows, whispering about the way the boy used his pieces like a true player. They sensed something formidable, but no one dared say it aloud, held back by the unspoken weight of Claudia and Brant's presence. Ruth stood behind her son, hands clenched, eyes following his every move. Her heart was heavy with worry, yet lit with a pride she could no longer suppress. She heard Claudia's insults, heard Brant's threat, but they all began to fade as she saw how strangely calm Caleb remained. Ruth understood that her son was not just playing chess, he was resisting the weight of this entire room. Brant interrupted again, striking his baton once more, his voice low and deliberate, this time like a command to the entire hall. Don't forget whose party this is. The boy will learn his lesson. Some guests burst out laughing, but not everyone joined. A woman in an emerald dress shook her head slightly, her expression unsettled, while a middle-aged man rubbed his chin, his eyes fixed not on the humiliation, but on the unfolding strategy. Claudia finally made her next move, lips pressed tight, the smirk replaced by strained focus. Caleb responded immediately with a sharp countermove, catching her off guard. Those near the board could see the tension rising in every gesture, in the way Claudia bit her lip, in the cold stare Brant cast across the table. The chessboard was no longer a game. It had become a battleground where arrogance met intellect, where power stared down truth. From the very first move, the fragile balance had cracked, revealing a rising undercurrent of defiance from the boy everyone had underestimated. In the gilded room, beneath dazzling light, the early laughter had shifted into quiet tension. No one said it aloud, but one by one they began to realize this cruel joke might not unfold the way they had expected. The sound of chess pieces striking the board echoed clearly through the dead-silent hall. Claudia Vexler lifted her white queen, twirling it between her fingers as if toying with a priceless jewel, then placed it down with a sharp, dry click. She looked up, the corners of her mouth curling into a mocking smile, and spoke loudly enough for every guest to hear. "Let's see how far this boy's brain can go. I think he's only smart enough to pick up a napkin from the floor." Scattered laughter broke out across the room, but it lacked force of before, because from the very first move, people had noticed something different in the way Caleb played. Caleb Johnson sat upright, eyes locked in total focus on the board. Not a drop of sweat, not a flicker of hesitation. He moved his knight with a clean, swift motion that made Claudia brief falter. The black piece shot forward like an arrow, blocking Claudia's path. The room shifted for a sec, murmurs spreading quickly. "He knows what he's doing." That wasn't random. A nearby guest furrowed his brow, his gaze shifting from contempt to concentration. Ruth Johnson stood silently behind her son, fingers clasped so tightly they turned white. Each time Claudia insulted him, Ruth felt her heart tighten, but every sharp countermove from Caleb filled her with a pride she could hardly contain. She trembled, terrified for her little boy facing the mockery of a room full of power, yet at the same time felt a strange light glowing from his calm posture and steady eye. Ruth knew her son wasn't just playing chess, he was confronting prejudice itself. Claudia tilted her head at the board, her smirk beginning to fade. She masked her surprise with an even harsher tone. "Oh, now you're clapping for a pawn or a knight that happens to land in the right place. This is nothing but beginner's luck." She picked up a rook and slammed it down harder than usual, as if trying to bury Caleb under pressure. Then she looked directly at Ruth, her voice syrupy and false. "You must be so proud, watching your son face someone like me. Don't forget, this is an honor you'll never afford." The words cut like blades into Ruth's chest. Caleb didn't look up. He kept thinking, his small hand resting lightly on a bishop. After a few short seconds, he made a long move, cutting off Claudia's advance. A few guests standing near the board gasped, their expressions shifting visibly. The laughter was gone now, replaced by a seriousness in their eyes, as if they were witnessing something unbelievable from a child they had all dismissed. Claudia burst out laughing, the sound forced and stiff. "How adorable. He thinks this is an actual match? This is just for fun, and the boy is only dragging out his own embarrassment." Her words clung to arrogance, trying to cover the flicker of unease that had just appeared. But those who understood chess were no longer easily convinced. They exchanged glances, a few nodding slightly to one another. In the silence of the hall, the earlier amusement had been replaced with focus, a heaviness slowly overtaking the mockery. Caleb continued. The black piece under his fingers moved with precision, pushing Claudia into a corner. His eyes lit up, fearless, without needing a single word of challenge. His moves alone were enough to quiet the room that had been laughing moments earlier. The once noisy space thickened with tension, every small breath now audible. That silence became the strongest response to a truth no one could deny. This game was no longer a joke. Ruth felt her eyes sting, part worry, part emotion. She understood that, From this moment on, her son had crossed the thin line between spectacle and reality. Caleb was no longer the boy standing in the shadows of a luxurious hall, but a true player, ready to face even the harshest gaze. Her entire heart poured into each of his moves, trembling at the revenge that might follow, bursting with pride as Caleb's brilliance began to shift the room's perception. Claudia placed her hand on the table, tapping her fingers lightly, trying to appear composed, but the lines on her forehead were clear, her frown growing deeper with every sharp move. She lifted her head, glanced at Brant as if seeking backup, then turned to Caleb and spoke with condescension. "Go ahead, boy. Let me teach you one final lesson, that the lowly never beat the high." The entire hall fell silent. The early laughter had vanished, replaced by an overwhelming tension. A few guests no longer dared to speak, their expressions solemn, as if watching a reversal quietly take form. Each time Caleb placed a piece, they leaned forward, listening for the soft click, holding their breath as the board shifted again. In that atmosphere, Ruth understood exactly what was happening. The public humiliation Claudia had staged was no longer just an attempt to belittle a child. It had become a true confrontation, where Caleb's intellect was chipping away at the wall of arrogance piece by piece, and those who once laughed were now falling silent, placed by serious eyes, a recognition unspoken but impossible to ignore. The air in the grand hall had grown so tense that every breath could be heard. Outside, the violin music had faded, giving way to the dry clicks of chess pieces touching the board. Claudia Vexler pressed her lips tight, trying to maintain her smile, but a flicker of unease passed across her face. Caleb Johnson still sat upright, his gaze steady and calm. The small boy once summoned as entertainment was now commanding the attention of this gold-plated room. In the back row, a young man quietly slipped a phone from his jacket pocket. He leaned back, whispered excitedly to the person beside him, "This is going online." The other raised an eyebrow, but before a reply could come, the phone was already aimed at the board, capturing the image of Caleb facing Claudia. Even a quick glance revealed the imbalance. On one side, an arrogant millionaire. On the other, a boy in simple clothes. But it was precisely that contrast that made the man filming feel this moment was worth more than any luxury act at the party. Caleb placed his hand on a pawn and moved it in a way that made everyone with chess knowledge fall silent. It was the Caro-Can, a famous opening that required patience and precision. The eyes of several experienced players lit up. They exchanged surprised, almost confused glances. One whispered, "That's not a child's move. He knows exactly what he's doing." Minutes earlier, the room had been full of mocking laughter, but now it was silent, drawn in by the game where Caleb was controlling the rhythm of the match. The phone shook in the man's hand, the lens trembling with his own heart. He murmured to himself, barely audible, "This isn't a joke." The words escaped from a place of stunned disbelief. He zoomed in, capturing the moment. Claudia frowned, locking on Caleb's unwavering gaze, and quickly tapped to upload. Within seconds, the short clip was online, tagged with a brief but intriguing caption, "Maid son faces millionaire at chess." No one in the hall knew that in that instant, a storm of attention had begun to stir. Within minutes, the video received its first comments from the man's friends, some in coffee shops, others in small apartments miles away. A few lines popped. "Is this real? Kid playing chess with Claudia Vexler?" Then, only minutes later, the clip was being reshared, the ripple spreading like waves on water. While inside the grand hall, Claudia focused on crushing her small opponent. Outside, the world had started watching this lopsided match unfold. Caleb didn't know the clip was spreading, and he didn't need to. All he knew was the board in front of him, the black and white pieces locked in battle, and the pressing silence surrounding him. He moved his knight, setting up a tight defensive position. Claudia looked at the board, her smile stiffening. She wasn't used to being cornered by the same child she had summoned as a joke. Brant stood nearby, tapping his cane against the floor, his hoarse voice breaking in. "Don't think he's good. This is Mrs. Vexler's party. He'll never win." But the words sounded hollow, an empty echo in a room now entirely drawn into the mat. Ruth stood still behind him, her heart pounding with every move. She no longer heard the mocking laugh, nor noticed the scornful glances from the crowd. All she saw was her son sitting there, small in the middle of luxury, yet impossibly steady. She saw his hands move the pieces with confidence, saw the light in his eyes as he focused, and for the first time, Ruth realized Caleb was no longer standing in her shadow. He was standing on his own. An elderly guest with silver hair leaned forward near the board. He spoke just loud enough for a few around him to hear. "This boy knows the Caro-Can opening. Do you understand what that means? He's not just playing for fun. He's playing like a master." Those nearby turned to him, then looked back at the board, their faces shifting from ridicule to confusion. The mockery in their eyes cracked, replaced by growing attention. Meanwhile, outside the room, the first wave of comments had started to appear, fueled by outrage. "Humiliating a maid's son at a party? This is blatant racism." racism. Others wrote, look at that kid's eye, that's the look of a genius. The clip spread like wildfire, hashtags emerged, and short tweets flooded timeline. In less than 10 minutes, the video from the lavish banquet broken through its golden walls and landed on phones and screens everywhere. Inside the gilded room, Claudia tried to keep smiling. She placed a piece on the board and spoke loudly to drown out the unfamiliar tension. It's just luck. Don't think one move makes him someone he's not. But her words echoed in the silence, and no one laughed along. Some guests looked at her with strange expressions, as if the ironclad confidence she always carried had begun to crack. Caleb didn't respond. He reached out, moved a pawn, eyes so focused the outside world seemed to vanish. Then the sharp click of the piece hitting the board rang out, clear, firm, like a silent declaration that this was no joke, and he would not let anyone turn him into one. Claudia Vexler gripped the chess piece tightly, her eyes flashing with challenge. She leaned back in her chair, let out a dry laugh, then suddenly tilted her head and stared straight at Caleb Johnson, her sharp, mocking voice ringing across the hall. You're just mimicking. Real intelligence doesn't belong to that skin color. Her words cut like a blade, slicing through the air. A few guests chuckled out of habit, but the laughter sounded weak, no longer thunderous. Claudia's arrogance seemed intact, yet the lines around her eyes and the strain in her voice revealed the unease she was trying to hide. From the back rows, an older man with graying hair, a scholar invited to the event, suddenly stood up. His eyes lit up as he looked at the board, his hands trembling with emotion. He couldn't hold back and exclaimed, "That's a master-level move." His voice broke through the room's fragile facade, drawing glances from guests, surprised to see a respected academic openly acknowledging Caleb's skill. But Claudia snapped back instantly, her hand slapping the table in warning. "Sit down. This is my party." Her command was aimed not only at the scholar, but also as a warning to anyone thinking of siding with Caleb. The old man slowly returned to his seat, but his eyes stayed bright, and the faint smile on his lips quietly declared he had seen the truth. Caleb didn't look up, didn't glance toward either the mocker or the man who had spoken up for him. He simply lifted a piece, his fingers placing it precisely on the board. The room fell silent for a moment because that move opened up a sharp formation, pinning Claudia's pieces unexpectedly. No word, no reaction, just one movement that answered every insult. In the soft light, Caleb sat still, his eyes steady, face calm, as if everything happening around him was just meaningless noise. Unable to bear the silence, Officer Brandt roared, his voice rough with rage. "If he wins, it's because he cheated." He gripped his baton and slammed it against the floor, startling several guests. The echo rose to the high ceiling and rolled back like a wave, shaking the room with raw aggression. But this time, instead of joining in laughter, many guests exchanged looks, their faces uncertain. A few frowned. They could see clearly now that the accusation wasn't rooted in reason, but in fear of facing the truth. Claudia glanced quickly at Brandt, her eyes flashing with irritation. She didn't want his outburst to ruin the party, but she still needed him to keep Caleb under pressure, so she forced a smile back onto her face, placed a piece on the board, and tried to appear confident. But her hand trembled slightly, and the piece slid before settling into place. The guests nearest the board didn't miss it. Their expressions shifted, no longer openly scornful, but focused, unreadable. Caleb continued, slow but certain, moving his bishop into a sharp position that forced Claudia to retreat. A wave of murmurs rose again. The silver-haired scholar tilted his head, whispering to those beside him, "This is true Caro-Can strategy, and it's meticulously calculated. The boy knows exactly what he's doing." Few younger guests exchanged glances, surprise flashing in their eyes. The mocking laughter had vanished, replaced by attention tight as wire, where silence now carried more weight than any insult. Ruth Johnson remained standing, her heart pounding, eyes locked on the board. She heard every insult, every strike of the cane on the floor, but it all faded as she looked at Caleb. Her small, quiet son, the one who often avoided eye contact, now sat upright, eyes blazing, facing Claudia head-on. In that gaze, Ruth saw a confidence she had never dared to believe she could pass on to him. Claudia clenched her teeth, masking her unease with a sharp laugh. "Fine then, if you want to try, I'll show you the difference between the high-born and a floor-scrubbing boy." She pushed her white queen deep into the board, hoping to turn the tide, but Caleb calmly moved his knight, cutting off the path. A collective gasp spread through the hall, and hands rose to cover mouths, shocked by the boldness of the move. Brandt slammed his cane again, louder this time, the echo piercing. He shouted, "Don't be fooled! He's cheating! There's no way a kid plays like that." But his fury no longer stirred laughter. Instead, his words rang like proof of helplessness. A few guests shook their head, and others began whispering about the precision in Caleb's every move. A young woman nearby tilted her head, her eyes lit up, and she whispered, "This isn't just any child. He's a prodigy." The words reached many ears, and heads began to nod. The early mockery was giving way to a growing awe, like a spark catching dry straw. Claudia felt her whole body burning, sweat forming on her forehead. She glanced around and saw the shift in the crowd's eye. The party meant to celebrate her power now seemed to be slipping away. Every move Caleb made cut into the pride she had spent years building. But Claudia couldn't stop. She was trapped in the very game she had created. Caleb still said nothing. Each of his moves was a silent protest, stronger than any shouted word. He sat there, small in front of the large board, but his presence had silenced the entire room. No one had expected that the maid's son could shift the atmosphere and force the powerful to watch his every quiet move with full attention. The laughter had vanished, replaced by a heavy silence. Brant scowled. Claudia tried to smile, but it was forced, and the guests sat a little straighter, their eyes locked on the chessboard. Under the glaring lights, the match was no longer entertainment. It had become proof of a truth no one could ignore, and from that moment on, Caleb Johnson was no longer a side character in Claudia Vexler's party. He had become the center of the entire room, using nothing but his mind to force everyone into quiet recognition. The tension that had stretched tight across the banquet hall now began to crack in a way no one had anticipated. Claudia Vexler sat frozen at the board, her diamond-stacked hands trembling as she tried to hold her piece steady. The usual arrogant confidence faded, replaced by beads of sweat forming on her forehead. She wiped them quick, but the gesture only made it more obvious, drawing surprised glances from nearby guests. She wasn't used to being cornered, especially not by the maid's young son. And yet, every move that had just been played made it clear Caleb Johnson was no joke. Beside her, Officer Brant couldn't bear the tightening silence that was pressing down on the room. He suddenly slammed the table, the sound loud enough to rattle the wine glasses and startle a few guests. Brant shouted, his voice raw and cutting through the space. "This boy is not allowed to win." The outburst cracked open like a confession, revealing fear of defeat more than a claim of authority. Instead of igniting laughter, the words drew frown. Some guests shook their heads, others leaned in, whispering. The aggression no longer felt like part of a party. It had crossed a line. Caleb said nothing, his eyes still locked on the board. He placed his hand on the knight, lifted it gently, and moved it into a dangerous position. The motion was calm, unhurried, but when the piece touched the board, it landed like a blow against Claudia's pride. The position shifted instantly, her white pieces forced back, the path to victory beginning to open. The whole room stared. A stray murmur broke the silence. A nearby guest, face flushed with tension, stammered aloud, He's ahead." The words spread like a match dropped on dry straw. Eyes widened, breathing quickened, expressions froze. No one in the room had believed it was possible, yet now they were watching it unfold. The young guest's phone camera slowly panned, capturing the exact moment of Claudia's shock. Her face had gone pale, lips trembling, eyes wide but stripped of their usual power. The lens caught everything, a striking contrast to the woman who had entered the room to flattery and applause. Behind her, the guests who once whistled now held their breath, none daring to make a sound. They knew what was happening no longer belonged to the world of party entertainment. The hall fell into silence, so heavy even Brant's cane no longer echoed the way it had before. Every gaze turned toward the board, where a small but steady boy had turned the game. The silence wasn't indifference. It was proof that a truth could no longer be denied. Claudia's cruel performance had collapsed, and everyone was now witnessing the moment she began to lose her power on the very stage she created. Deep down, Ruth Johnson felt her vision blur with tears. She didn't dare let them fall, only placed a hand over her chest, her heart pounding. Her son was doing what she had never dared to imagine, standing tall beneath the weight of contemptuous eyes, silencing them not with anger, but with intellect. This was no longer just a chess match. It was the moment the scales tipped, where a child once dismissed was forcing the powerful to face the truth. Claudia clenched a piece in her hand, her eyes fixed on the board, but her mind in disarray. She wanted to laugh to reclaim her confidence, to turn to the crowd and reassert her control, but laughter had vanished long ago. There was no one clapping, no one cheering. Those who once stood behind her now remained silent, their faces tense, as if waiting for the end. Claudia could feel it. The world she had built with wealth and power was crumbling, undone by the quiet moves of a single boy. The camera kept rolling, its light reflecting off the face of the one holding it. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from the knowledge that he had captured a moment that would shake the world. Claudia's stunned expression, her trembling hand, Brant's useless cane, and Caleb's calm, steady gaze, all contained within a few seconds of footage that weighed more than any speech ever could. No one in the room dared to move. Wine glasses stopped mid-sway, frozen smiles faded, and even breaths became cautious. A silence settled like a weight over everything, and at the center of it, Caleb Johnson sat upright, his eyes shining like blades cutting through the dark. In that moment, he was no longer the maid's son, no longer the underestimated child. He was the embodiment of an undeniable truth, that intellect and dignity could slice through every false barrier, force the world to stop and see. Outside, while the banquet hall remained locked in tense silence, the short video of Caleb facing Claudia exploded across social media. From an anonymous account, in just a few hours, the clip had appeared on countless platforms, each share adding thousands of new comments. Views surged like a flood, reaching millions and landing the video in trending sections overnight. No one needed to know who Claudia was or where the party had taken place. They simply saw a small boy facing a powerful woman, and his calm silence moved millions. Comments poured in, thousands of people writing at once. "This is a real genius, not a joke." Short sentences filled with anger and awe. Some said they had replayed the moment he placed the piece over and over, mesmerized by his steady focus. One wrote, "The way he placed that piece gave me chills. He didn't need to speak. One move said everything." The emotion spread so quickly that even people who had never cared about chess were drawn in because what they saw wasn't just a game, but the image of fair resistance. On chess forum, well-known players began to speak up. They broke down Caleb's Caro-Kann opening and emphasized that it was no accident. One grandmaster wrote, "This is a strategy that requires deep understanding. If a child can execute this, he's not just talented, he's a prodigy." His post was shared tens of thousands of times, strengthening the belief that this was a rare phenomenon unfolding in real time. The online world erupted, and comment after comment struck like knives at Claudia and Brandt. Those who had mocked and tried to turn Caleb into a joke. Many expressed outrage at Claudia's humiliation of the boy. "Mocking the maid's son at a party? This is blatant discrimination," one user wrote. Dozens of posts followed. "Kid didn't have to speak, just look into his eye. That's intellect." The hashtag Justice for Caleb shot to the top of trending chart. In just a few hours, Caleb Johnson went from an unknown boy to a symbol of justice, a living answer to the question of what happens when intellect stands its ground against power. In cafes, people passed phones around to rewatch clip. In office buildings, workers set down their pens to talk about Caleb's sharp move. On buses, passengers stared at screens, shaking their heads in outrage at Claudia's mocking tone. Each view, each share felt like another crack in the wall of arrogance Claudia had built. Her image warped in the eyes of the public. They no longer saw a powerful millionaire, but someone whose pride had turned into a permanent stain. Meanwhile, Ruth Johnson sat in her small apartment, eyes red as she watched her son appear across every screen. She never sought fame, nor did she welcome the noise, but the words flooding the internet told her that justice had chosen Caleb. Every supportive comment, every post of praise felt like a flame chasing away the fear she had carried for so long. Ruth glanced at her son, still sitting quietly at his old chess table, fingers tapping gently, eyes calm. Caleb seemed untouched by the storm outside, but Ruth knew his heart had already embraced the belief that truth holds more power than any false display of status. The clip didn't stop at national borders. International news outlets picked it up, headlines pouring in. Maid's son challenges millionaire in chess match. Young prodigy stuns grand banquet hall. Those words spread far, turning Caleb into a symbol of intellectual fairness. His rise brought not just recognition, but overwhelming pressure on Claudia and Brandt. Though they remained silent, their images were everywhere, now standing as emblems of arrogance, starkly opposed to Caleb's quiet resolve. The clip's explosion changed the entire narrative. What began as a cruel joke at a private event became the story of millions, a rallying point where the public found resistance and the powerless found hope. And in that powerful current, a 12-year-old boy sitting upright at a chessboard unintentionally sparked a flame that leapt beyond the gilded room and ignited an unstoppable storm across society. The hashtag Justice for Caleb began as a spark in the flood of content, then grew into a blaze consuming all of social media. Every post, every personal caption carried those words, pushing the tag to the top of national trend. Twitter, Facebook, and TikTok users joined in, each adding their voice to complete a picture of injustice now laid bare. It was no longer just a video of a chess game, but a story of dignity, intelligence, and collective outrage against elite cruelty. Public figures began to join the movement. A comedian with millions of followers reposted the clip with the caption, "A slap in the face of prejudice, delivered on the chessboard." A respected journalist wrote, "The world has no shortage of Claudia Vexler, but what's rare is the quiet courage of a Caleb Johnson." These voices added fuel to the fire, sending the hashtag beyond borders and into global headlines. The contrast was undeniable. On one side, power weaponized to belittle. On the other, intellect rising, quiet force. Public pressure quickly turned toward Claudia and Officer Brandt. Angry forums dug up their information, and their images were shared alongside a torrent of criticism. "This is the face of arrogance," one user wrote, paired with the image of Claudia frozen at the chessboard. As for Brandt, post after post condemned his use of police authority to intimidate a child. Photos showing him slamming his cane on the floor, his face flushed with rage, spread quickly online, often captioned, "This is blatant abuse of power." The pressure didn't stay confined to social media. A group of students from a prestigious university hosted an online panel on class discrimination, using Caleb's story as a case study. Several organizations advocating for children's rights and social justice issued press releases, demanding an investigation into the public humiliation at the party. These voices echoed across platforms, igniting a wave of public discourse. Meanwhile, television news ran constant coverage, interviewing chess experts to break down Caleb's moves, turning him into an unexpected symbol. Claudia Vexler remained silent, but her silence only intensified the public's anger. With each passing hour, the hashtag Justice for Caleb amassed millions of new mentions. The conversation had moved beyond a chess match. It had become a larger confrontation between intelligence dismissed and power used to degrade. Outrage was no longer just a flurry of comment. It had become real pressure, forcing Claudia and Brandt to face an irreversible reality. They had become symbols of arrogance undone by justice. The entire room was tense, holding its breath as Caleb Johnson placed his hand on the final piece. Every eye was fixed on those small fingers, as if one single move could decide the outcome of the entire evening. Sitting upright, his eyes lit with sharp focus, Caleb calmly lifted the piece and set it down in the checkmate position. The soft click of the piece touching the board was so faint that many nearly missed it, yet the weight of that sound echoed across the gilded hall. In perfect silence, the game ended without a single declaration. The board had spoken for itself. Claudia Vexler froze, the queen in her hand suspended mid-air, her eyes wide with disbelief, her face drained of color, lips trembling but unable to form a word. From the powerful woman who had entered the hall in a storm of applause, Claudia now sat like someone stripped bare of her arrogance, under dozens of piercing stares. She looked at the board, then at Caleb, as if searching for a logical explanation, but there was nothing left to grasp. The match was over, and she had lost in humiliating silence. A soft murmur rippled through the audience, quickly turning into sharp, shallow breath. Some covered their mouths, others stared in disbelief. The mockery had long vanished, and now everyone was bound by the weight of a historic moment unfolding before them. The man who had scoffed earlier now bowed his head toward the board, too ashamed to speak. The woman in the emerald dress, who once sneered, now had eyes glistening with awe. In that moment, every prejudice and snide remark shattered, replaced by a silence of unspoken recognition. Caleb remained seated, neither smiling nor gloating. He simply took a long breath, his gaze lingering on the board as if committing every move to memory. For him, this wasn't entertainment. It was a real battle, one that proved to the entire room that intelligence knew no class or color. That calm, steady presence made him appear all the more formidable, like a small mountain no one could shake. Outside, the phone camera kept rolling, capturing Claudia's stunned face and Caleb's quiet composure. That ending would soon multiply into thousands of copies, ready to break out of this room and ignite a far greater storm. But in that very instant, even without the world watching, everyone in the banquet hall knew they had just witnessed a complete reversal. Boy summoned to be a joke had turned the joke itself into a sentence against arrogance. The room, once tense and silent, suddenly erupted like a wave crashing ashore. Gasp, the scrape of chairs, and then a rush of uncontrollable noise burst forth. Some shouted in disbelief, others jumped to their feet, stunned that the game had ended like that. Amid the chaos, Officer Brandt lost control, his face flushed red, neck veins bulging as he screamed into the crowd, "Cheating! I'll arrest you!" His shrill voice rang through the grand hall, startling several guests, some of whom stepped back in alarm. But instead of restoring authority, that shout resembled a final collapse, exposing the desperation of a man clinging to the shattered shell of power. Claudia Vexler tried to remain composed, but her expression had already crumbled, and every attempt to appear calm looked absurd in the eyes of those watching. Caleb's composure was like a quiet fire, burning away every lie. Amid the noise of the crowd, the boy sat up, his eyes fixed on the chessboard, as if the pieces were the only thing that mattered. That very calmness only made Brandt's outburst feel more misplaced and hollow. A few guests even began turning to look at him with scorn. Someone muttered, "There's no denying it anymore. That's a real victory." The phone camera kept recording without missing a single detail. The lens captured Claudia's panic, Brandt's shouting, Caleb's strange stillness, and the moment the room erupted. When the footage was uploaded, it spread faster than the person filming could have imagined. Millions of views poured in within hours, then multiplied, accompanied by thousands of angry and thrilled comments. Every frame became irrefutable evidence, a chess game that shattered the arrogant mask Claudia and Brandt had built. The public didn't just see a child winning a match, they saw a symbol. They saw injustice being challenged in the most luxurious setting, a small boy silently conquering silence itself, and false power laid bare. Clips spread like a storm, from social media to television news, from living rooms to cafes, from angry whispers to calls for justice. Within less than a day, the world knew Caleb Johnson, knew the final move, and knew the truth, that intelligence could bring down any privilege. The next morning, Caleb Johnson's name appeared across countless headlines. News channels raced to replay the clip from the lavish party, where the boy faced Claudia Vexler and ended the match to everyone's astonishment. Reporters crowded outside the small apartment where Ruth Johnson lived with her son. Cameras zoomed in on Caleb's face, his eyes bright yet humble. He didn't say much, just sat at the old wooden table, still faintly smelling of worn chessbook. When asked why he agreed to sit across from Claudia, the boy replied quietly, "I just wanted to play a decent game of chess." That brief answer moved many, carrying no pride or arrogance, only the longing to be seen as a normal human being. Ruth stood beside him, trying to hide her tearful eye, but when the microphone turned toward her, she couldn't hold back her emotion. Her voice cracked, her hand clutching a worn kitchen towel. "He just wanted to be respected. I've always taught my son that value lies not in money, but in how we hold on to our dignity. But I never imagined he'd have to prove that in front of dozens of people mocking him at a party." Her words cut straight into the hearts of viewers, leaving many in tears. Headlines immediately seized her quote, placing it prominently on front page. Meanwhile, Claudia Vexler chose confrontation. She appeared on television with her personal lawyer, her heavily made-up face unable to hide exhaustion. Sitting upright, her voice steady, but tinged with irritation, she said, "This was all orchestrated. I was manipulated into a publicity stunt. A child cannot possess that level of skill. Someone was clearly coaching him." Her declaration aired before millions, but instead of gaining sympathy, it only intensified public outrage. The press quickly pushed back. Major outlets published in-depth analyses from chess experts who had reviewed every one of Caleb's moves. A renowned grandmaster stated, "No one could prearrange those plays for the boy. That was real-time calculation, instinct, and creativity. Only someone with a deep understanding of chess could demonstrate." Diagrams of the gameplay spread rapidly, serving as undeniable evidence countering Claudia's claim. People compared Caleb's composed demeanor at the board with Claudia's shaken expression. The contrast so stark, it made her defense fall flat. But the media didn't stop there. They dug into the broader societal context. Op-eds in leading newspapers explored class discrimination, emphasizing that this wasn't just a chess match, it was proof of the divide between power and intellect. They highlighted how Claudia used her wealth to demean Caleb, and how Brandt wielded his police authority to intimidate a child. That glaring contrast spread widely, turning the viral video into a national conversation about justice. TV networks hosted roundtable panels with lawyers, sociologists, teachers, and chess masters to dissect the incident from every angle. The more Claudia spoke, the deeper she sank into criticism. Several newspapers dug into her past, resurfacing quotes once deemed arrogant and highlighting controversial behavior in business circles. Brandt's silence also came under scrutiny, as he was a police officer who used his authority to intimidate a child, something that only fueled public outrage. Articles repeatedly featured images of Brandt slamming his cane on the floor of the hall, each photo followed by thousands of condemning comments. Meanwhile, Caleb's story was being told from a more human perspective. Journalists visited his former school and interviewed his old teacher. One teacher shared, "Caleb was always quiet, but when he sat in front of a chessboard, he became a different person, confident and sharp. I'm not surprised he won. The only surprise is that the world finally noticed." These words further solidified Caleb's image in the public's eye. As days passed, the coverage of Claudia and Caleb only intensified, with society's interest showing no sign of fading. News outlets continued to feature Ruth and her son on front pages, pairing their photo with a simple yet powerful message: "Respect is not a gift, it's a basic right." These words closed the evening news, leaving viewers with a mix of pain and hope. From that moment on, the story had moved beyond the confines of a single party, becoming an issue that the entire society had to face. Right after Claudia Vexler's televised justification aired, top chess experts were invited to comment. They reviewed the full clip, analyzed every move Caleb Johnson made using detailed diagrams, and compared them to classic matches. One international grandmaster spoke on live television. "The way this boy used the Caro-Kann opening shows deep strategic understanding. This wasn't chance. It's the innate ability of someone with exceptional thinking." That statement was replayed across multiple channels, reinforcing the belief Caleb didn't win by luck. He was truly a prodigy. On online forums, each expert analysis was reshared with tens of thousands of comments. Viewers paused the video, comparing Caleb's moves to those of renowned grandmasters, marveling at the similarity. A chess coach in Europe wrote, "If Caleb receives the right training, he could become one of the greatest players of this century." These respected opinions ignited public excitement, making it impossible for anyone to dismiss his victory as mere luck. Alongside professional recognition came rising anger. Viewers weren't just discussing Caleb's talent, they were furious that he had been dragged into the match as a joke. Editorials emphasized that turning a child into entertainment is a violation of dignity, and when that child happens to be the son of a housemaid, it becomes a clear symbol of discrimination. Difficult questions were raised. If the video hadn't gone viral, would the truth have ever come to light? Public pressure left social organizations with no choice but to get involved. The Child Protection Association issued a call for local authorities to launch a formal investigation into the public humiliation that occurred during the party. Another organization, dedicated to fighting racial discrimination, released a strong statement. "This is not just an individual incident. It reflects a broader societal issue. If we fail to act, we accept silence in the face of injustice." These words flooded the media, transforming the story from a scandal into a full-fledged political and social issue. Thousands of people took to the streets holding signs, many carrying images of Caleb sitting at the chessboard, his expression calm and composed. On social media, live streams of the protests spread rapidly, the phrase #JusticeForCaleb appearing on every banner and in every post. The atmosphere forced officials to speak out, and a government spokesperson declared, "We will open a thorough investigation to ensure that all acts of discrimination and abuse of power are properly addressed." The mounting pressure placed Claudia and Officer Brandt squarely at the center of the storm. Claudia tried to deny everything, but every excuse she gave was quickly countered by expert analysis. Brandt remained silent, but that silence only fueled public outrage. News outlets published more photos of him at the party, Kane striking the floor, face twisted in anger, followed by countless comments. "This is a man using power to threaten a child." That image was repeated again and again as a symbol of abuse of authority. In the evening news, Caleb appeared not just as a boy with remarkable chess skill, but as a figure who sparked a collective yearning for justice. The anchor closed the broadcast with the word, "A child may not change society overnight, but sometimes society changes when everyone sees the truth through a child's eye." That line ended the broadcast, but ignited a public outcry like never before, compelling government involvement, pushing the entire society into a deeper conversation, and forcing Claudia and Brandt to begin facing the consequences of their own actions. The outrage on social media didn't stop at calls for justice or street protest. It quickly turned into direct pressure on the local police department. Media swarmed the station, cameras fixed on the entrance where Officer Brandt worked. When he was finally forced to appear, his somber face and heavy gait were immediately captured. Reporters raised their microphones in unison, flashbulbs flaring non-stop, leaving Brandt visibly rattled. One reporter pressed hard, voice sharp, "What exactly did you call that child at the party?" The question landed like a hammer blow against the silence he was trying to maintain. Crowds gathered outside, holding signs high as chants drowned out any attempt at excuses. They shouted accusations, voices rising. "Does a police officer have the right to humiliate a child? Is that what justice looks like to you?" Brandt clenched his fists, trying to push through the crowd, but every step was swallowed by angry cries. TV crews recorded him being trapped in the sea of people, his jaw clenched, but his eyes betraying fear he could no longer hide. During press briefings, the police department spokesperson was bombarded with questions about Brandt's conduct. News outlets replayed the clip hundreds of times, him slamming his cane on the floor, yelling at Caleb. Every frame became evident, analyzed by commentators as a symbol of abuse of power. Articles repeatedly emphasized that an enraged officer threatening a child wasn't just a personal disgrace, it struck at the core of public trust in law enforcement. Human rights organizations joined in, issuing formal letters demanding an independent investigation, asserting that the incident pointed to systemic issues. They argued that if an officer could humiliate a child in a lavish public setting, what might happen in the dark corners of empty streets? That line of reasoning fueled even greater public outrage, and the calls to discipline Brandt intensified. On television, sociologists warned that trust in justice could not survive if silence continued to shield wrongdoing. Brandt appeared once more on camera, this time visibly pale. A young reporter asked plainly, "Do you realize your words to Caleb have become a symbol of disdain and class prejudice?" He paused for a few seconds, eyes darting around for an escape, before mumbling in a hoarse voice, "That wasn't my intention." The weak response immediately incited another wave of fury, with the crowd shouting that a fake apology wouldn't erase the truth. Pressure wasn't only from the public anymore, it came from within the fort. Some colleagues began distancing themselves, afraid of being pulled into the fallout. News reports revealed that Brandt's superiors had called an emergency meeting to review his ethical violation. That news spread like wildfire, leaving Brandt with virtually no way out. Every word he had uttered that night now returned as damning proof, suffocating the very career he had spent years building. During live broadcasts, people continued to stand outside the police headquarters, holding signs high, eyes fierce with determination. They didn't just want an explanation, they wanted real justice. And with the hashtag Justice for Caleb still trending at the top, the pressure had moved beyond a fleeting social media storm into a tangible force, compelling the system to bow to the truth. Television networks replayed the party video on loop, each detail slowed down and carefully analyzed. Viewers could clearly see Officer Brandt standing close to the chessboard, his cane striking the floor hard, his voice full of rage as he glared at Caleb. The audio captured every insult, every harsh shout, and the moment Caleb remained seated, calm-eyed and composed. The contrast between Brandt's aggression and the child's composure only fueled public outrage. Commentators observed this wasn't a moment of lost temper, it was a public abuse of power, witnessed by dozens. Those images were clipped into short videos and spread rapidly across all social media platforms. On Twitter, a 10-second clip showing Brandt shouting in Caleb's face reached tens of millions of views. Below it, comments poured in. A police officer publicly humiliating a child. This is unacceptable. Many reposted the clip with subtitles emphasizing the insult, turning it into visual proof impossible to ignore. Close-up shots of Brandt's angry face, veins bulging, were shared with captions reading, "This is the true face of authority." In the face of this wave, Brandt was pulled into a series of public interrogations. Reporters pursued him relentlessly, microphones pressed to his face, firing questions. How do you justify yelling at a child? Do you believe your words are appropriate for someone in uniform? Surrounded by dozens of cameras and flashing lights, Brandt stumbled through confused answers, sometimes blaming the pressure of the moment, other times deflecting entirely. His lack of coherence only worsened his image, and every pause in his response deepened public anger. At one press conference, Brandt stood at the podium, sweat beading on his forehead and rolling down his face. He wiped it away quickly, but his dazed eyes and trembling voice betrayed everything. When a reporter asked, "Do you recall exactly what you said to Caleb?" Brandt bowed his head, muttered a few inaudible words, then fell silent. That moment was broadcast live, watched by millions who saw his discomfort in real time. Instant comments flooded in. This isn't remorse. This is a man cornered by the truth. In the studio of a major news network, experts analyzed Brandt's body language. A psychologist said, "His face is sweating nonstop, eyes avoid contact, speech broken. These are clear signs of someone trying to escape a question he knows he can't answer honestly." The analysis only cemented public belief that Brandt had exposed his own weakness in the face of truth. Brandt's silence afterward did nothing to help him. Each time he dodged the press, footage was spliced together, showing him walking briskly out of the station, his face tense and soaked in sweat, broadcast repeatedly as proof of a man cornered. Those clips played over and over, becoming the symbol of a police officer stripped of his authoritative mask. With every frame, the public grew more certain that this was the moment the system needed to act for real, not continue shielding its own. In the flood of public opinion, Brandt had no way out. He had once tried to cling to silence, hoping the storm would pass, but now, the evidence was too clear, and every drop of sweat on his face told the real story. Truth had prevailed, and any further denial was meaningless. After days of relentless media coverage, while public pressure still filled the headlines, an unexpected piece of news shifted the atmosphere. A prestigious high school, known for its special program for exceptionally gifted students, officially reached out to Ruth Johnson's family. In a public letter, the school board wrote that they had watched the entire video, consulted with experts to analyze each move, and believed Caleb Johnson deserved a full scholarship to nurture his rare talent. The invitation was not just an educational opportunity, but also an official acknowledgement of the brilliance and intelligence the boy had demonstrated before the world. When Ruth read the letter, her hands trembled, her eyes blurred with emotion. She had never imagined that amid all the noise and uproar, a door could open so wide for her son. All her life, Ruth only wished for Caleb to live in peace, to go to school like other children without bearing the weight of condescending stare. She had never dared to dream that one day her son would be called by a prestigious school offered a chance to reach for his dream. Tears streamed down her face as she held Caleb tightly and whispered, "My son, this is the greatest gift I've ever received." Caleb stayed quiet in his mother's embrace, his eyes shining but still carrying his usual calm. He understood that this scholarship was not just for him, proof that intelligence was not confined by class or status. It was a reward for resiliency. For that moment, he sat upright before the chessboard and proved his worth through action. When a reporter asked how he felt, Caleb simply smiled and said, "I want to learn more, so one day I can teach other kids to believe in themselves." That answer moved many, as it showed he was not thinking of himself first, but of how to share that belief. The press quickly covered the story of this special scholarship, treating it as a symbolic event. Bold headlines filled the front pages, from mockery to merit. The humiliated boy now enters the gates of knowledge. The public applauded the school's decision, seeing it as a rightful step to help repair the injustice Caleb had faced. Education experts commented that this was not only a chance for one individual, but a message to society. Talent can bloom anywhere, even in the most overlooked corner. In their small apartment, Ruth placed the letter on the wooden table where Caleb often played chess. She looked at her son with pride, remembering the long nights saving every coin to buy him a cheap chess set. She remembered the hours Caleb spent under the dim yellow light, flipping through old library books. Now, all that quiet effort had borne fruit. Ruth felt a weight lifted from her heart, replaced by a belief that her son's future would be brighter than she had ever dared hope. The story of the scholarship didn't end with the news. It became a widespread source of inspiration, especially for working-class families who had once believed their children would never break out of the limits imposed on them. In Caleb, they saw a symbol of hope, proof true worth can shine regardless of one's background. And as Ruth held her son tightly in overwhelming emotion, felt as if the world, too, embraced the story as a reminder. Sometimes, all it takes is one timely opportunity, one open door to knowledge, for centuries-old prejudice to lose its weight. While Caleb Johnson's name was being praised everywhere, Claudia Vexler sank deeper into crisis. Images of her sitting powerless at the chessboard were shared constantly, accompanied by mocking captions she had never faced throughout her powerful career. Business partners quietly withdrew, and contracts were frozen as companies feared her involvement might spark boycott. Analysts noted that Claudia's downfall was not due to losing a chess match, but because she had belittled a child's dignity. The arrogance that had once drawn admiration became a burden, turning her into a symbol of reckless pride. On forums, former employees of Claudia shared stories of being mistreated, further damaging her public image. Claudia wasn't the only one caught in the backlash. Officer Brandt also found himself swept up in the storm. After the video had been repeatedly analyzed and human rights organizations formally submitted complaints, the police department could no longer remain silent. A brief statement was issued. Brandt had been suspended pending investigation. The news flooded the media, aired on morning television, and was printed on the front pages of major newspapers. Anchors read each word clearly. An officer suspended after publicly humiliating a child at a high society event. The headline spread, making Brandt the center of intense criticism. Images of Brandt leaving the precinct in exhaustion were captured on camera. His face darkened, every step heavy, as he walked through a gauntlet of reporters shouting questions. "Do you regret it? Will you apologize? What do you think about the suspension?" Brandt didn't answer, only lowered his head and walked quickly, but the sweat beading on his forehead betrayed his tension. That scene was replayed over and over, becoming the image of a once confident officer now forced to retreat. Many commentators noted that suspension was likely only the beginning, as the mounting public pressure made it nearly impossible for Brandt to return to his former role. Against this backdrop, the contrast between the two images became increasingly stark. On one side stood Claudia and Brandt, representatives of privilege and arrogance, now facing the consequences of their own action. On the other stood Caleb, the boy at the chessboard, now embraced by society as a symbol of hope and justice. The media focused on this contrast, with many articles declaring, "We are witnessing a reversal of power, where intellect prevails and arrogance falls." These comments went beyond the event itself, sparking a wave of awareness within the community. As news of Claudia's loss of credibility and Brandt's suspension flooded the media, the public grew more convinced that what had happened was not just a passing scandal. It had become a public lesson, forcing society to confront how those in power treat the vulnerable. The story didn't end at the chessboard, but expanded into a wider conversation about accountability, fairness, and trust. And in all of it, Caleb and Ruth stood as proof that truth may be dismissed in a moment, but in the end, it rises and demands to be heard. On the day of the hearing, the courtroom was packed with reporters, cameras pointed from every angle, flashes going off non-stop. Claudia Vexler entered with her team of lawyers, still carrying herself with a trace of pride, but her face was nothing like it had been in her triumphant day. Layers of makeup couldn't hide the exhaustion, the dark circles under her eyes, or the forced smile. She tried to hold her head high, stepping firmly as if to prove she was still in control, but every move betrayed the anxiety she was desperately trying to mask. The courtroom fell completely silent as Claudia took the witness seat, eyes turned toward her, not with admiration, but with scrutiny. When asked to speak, Claudia tried to shift the narrative. She claimed the events at the party had been edited, that the media had twisted the truth to bring her down. Her voice rang out strong, but the tension in her expression only grew. Then the videos were played, exposing every humiliating word, every mocking smile, and her helplessness in defeat. The room grew heavy, and her arguments were drowned by the evidence. As she forced a smile to project confidence, murmurs rose from the audience, echoing doubt and disappointment. After Claudia, Officer Brandt was called to testify. He walked heavily, and the wooden chair let out a sharp creak as he sat down. Unlike the aggression he showed at the party, his face was pale, and his voice shook from the first sentence. As the prosecutor read aloud the words he had directed at Caleb that night, the audio played back from the video silenced the entire room. Brandt's voice cracked, stammering a denial of any intent to humiliate, insisting he only meant to maintain order. But those excuses rang hollow against the sound of his cane hitting the floor and the furious look in his eyes on screen. The prosecutor pressed hard, dissecting every detail. What did you call the boy? Do you deny yelling at the party that he would regret it? The barrage of questions made Brandt falter, his voice breaking, his resolve gone. Some people in the gallery shook their heads in dismay, and others exchanged knowing looks. Pressured from all sides, Brandt bowed his head, sweat dripping, his hands gripping the chair arms tightly. Claudia, sitting behind him, glanced toward Brandt as if seeking some connection, but what she saw was defeat. The hearing was no longer a place where she could hide behind status or empty promises. Everything was laid bare before the public, and Brandt's silence under questioning became a clearer admission than any verbal confession. Outside, the media reported every minute, bold headlines flashing. Claudia and Brandt faced the truth in court. Shaky words can't save the officer. Viewers watching live saw two once arrogant figures forced to confront reality. Protesters cheered outside the courthouse, knowing the people who mocked a child were finally being held accountable. And in the gaze of those watching, belief in justice was renewed once more. That insults and abuse of power could never withstand the force of truth. In the thick atmosphere of the courtroom, Claudia's unease and Brandt's trembling voice still lingering, the back door opened. Ruth Johnson stepped in, standing tall with steady stride. She was no longer the timid woman carrying trays at the party, but a proud witness, carrying with her a belief in truth. All eyes turned toward her, not with pity, but with respect. Ruth held her head high, her gaze unwavering, as if she was fully prepared to say what society needed to hear. In that moment, the entire courtroom fell silent, making way for the presence of a mother who had once endured in silence, now standing to defend her son. Right after Ruth, Caleb walked in, holding his worn-out chess book. It was the same book he had carried since his earliest days of learning the game, its cover frayed, carefully preserved. The sight of a 12-year-old boy, small in the solemn space of the courtroom, radiated a presence far beyond his years. Caleb's eyes were calm, not frightened, not proud, just quietly focused and intelligent. A few reporters captured the moment, their lenses locking onto the faint smile on his lips, and quickly broadcast it everywhere as a symbol of resilience. As Ruth stepped up to the witness stand, she glanced at her son, her eyes softening briefly, but then she looked straight at those seated before her, her voice firm and steady. She spoke of the moment Claudia summoned Caleb as if for amusement, of the mocking laughter that fell on them both, of the fear when Brandt blocked their way. But Ruth's voice didn't waver. It was confident, because she was no longer passive in this story. "My son didn't ask for special treatment," she said. "He just wanted to be respected like any other child." That sentence made many in the room lower their head, while the cameras quickly carried it out into the world as a simple but powerful message. When it was Caleb's turn, he didn't give a long speech. He simply opened the chessbook in his hands and held it up for everyone to see. His voice was small but clear. "I learned from this book. Every night after my mom came home from work, I'd read it and play by myself. No one planned anything for me. What I did came from loving chess and wanting to play fair." Those plain words silenced the entire courtroom. In that boy, people saw a maturity beyond his age, a composure that made Claudia's excuses feel even more empty. Many in the room nodded gently. Some reporters quietly jotted down every word. One of the judges listened intently, admiration flickering in his eyes. side. In the back row, Ruth sat still, her hands clasped, pride and emotion mixing, as she watched her son face dozens of watchful eyes without losing his calm. The clip of Caleb, holding his chessbook, eyes shining as he spoke of his passion, quickly became the most widely shared moment after the hearing, not only for confirming his talent, but for showing the strength, dignity, and belief. In the courtroom, there were no more whispers of doubt, no more mockery. Instead, everyone listened intently, as if witnessing a moment that rose above the event itself. Caleb didn't need grand words. It was his calm presence and the clarity in his eyes, like someone who had lived beyond his years, carried enough weight to shift the entire atmosphere. What began as a tense hearing had now become a place where the truth spoke most clearly through Ruth's proud voice and Caleb's steady gaze. The moment the verdict was announced, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted entirely. All the tense stares turned toward Caleb Johnson, as if he had rewritten the ending of the entire story. A young reporter standing in the courthouse hallway took notes while speaking into a recorder, saying, "This isn't just the victory of one boy, it's a powerful reminder that intelligence can break through the barriers of prejudice." That very day, major newspapers published editorials calling Caleb a symbol of intellectual justice, stating that the image of him sitting upright at the chessboard, making each move calmly, was proof of a strength that rose above social status. The courtroom filled with applause as the judge struck the gavel to close the trial. The clapping wasn't just to celebrate the verdict, it was an acknowledgement of Caleb himself. Many stood, turning to look at the boy and smiling. Some nodded, some clapped for a long time as if to prolong this historic moment. Ruth sat beside her son, tears streaming down her cheek, her eyes glowing with pride. She gently squeezed Caleb's hand, unable to speak, because everything had already been said through his actions on the journey to this point. The media immediately seized the moment. Footage of Caleb walking out of the courtroom, clutching his chessbook to his chest, aired on national television. Editors emphasized that he did not appear as a smug, but as a symbol of resilience, a child who only wanted to be respected but accidentally became a beacon shining light on injustice. On the evening news, anchors declared, "Caleb Johnson has carved his name into the public memory, not through a simple win, but through the quiet pride of intellect." Outside the courthouse, crowds erupted in cheers upon hearing the verdict. They held up signs that read #Justice for Caleb, their unified chants echoing down the street. Some people cried when they saw Ruth and Caleb emerge, surrounded by clapping hands and cheering voices. A middle-aged woman told a reporter, "We're not just glad that Claudia and Brant were held accountable, we're moved because a child showed us how to face the truth." That collective energy turned the scene outside the courthouse into something like a grand ceremony, where justice was honored in the arms of the community. On social media, the phrase, "symbol of intellectual justice," quickly trended. People used Caleb's image in posts against discrimination. Teachers shared their story with students in their classroom, and many parents proudly posted that their children had been inspired to believe in their own intelligence. Commentators emphasized Caleb's victory didn't just affirm his personal talent, it gave voice to everyone who had ever been diminished. Public satisfaction was also clearly expressed. After many tense days following the case, the public saw the sentencing of Claudia and Brant as a firm statement that no one stands above the law. Online forums were flooded with blunt comments. "Justice has spoken." They thought they could mock, but in the end had to bow their head. Especially clips from the courtroom showing Claudia lowering her face and Brant turning pale spread rapidly. People shared them with sharp captions, seeing them as a fitting end to arrogance and abuse of power. Caleb, despite the praise, remained as calm as ever. When a reporter asked if he was happy, he simply replied in a quiet voice, "I'm happy that people understand chess doesn't care about class, and respect should never be bought or sold." That brief, piercing answer was quoted everywhere, further strengthening his image as a figure beyond his years. Caleb's humility made the public even more convinced that he was not blinded by the spotlight, but still the same simple child who once sat for hours at an old wooden table, teaching himself chess. The trial ended, but its echoes reached far beyond the sentence itself. The community took satisfaction, not only because those who once mocked punished, but because they had witnessed a stunning reversal, from cruel ridicule to a lesson in dignity. The applause in the courtroom that day wasn't only for Caleb, but for the truth, for justice, and for the belief that a young boy could remind society of its most fundamental value, that intellect and self-respect are always stronger than any false authority. After the decisive sentencing of Claudia Vexler and the decision to strip Officer Brant of his position, the courtroom remained silent for a few seconds, as if giving everyone a moment to grasp what had just occurred. Then applause began, first scattered among the audience seats, then spreading into a resounding wave throughout the room. That applause wasn't simply to celebrate a verdict, but to recognize the victory of truth, the victory of a boy once treated as entertainment. Caleb Johnson, with his calm posture and bright eyes moving pieces during the reception, was now called by by the name used unanimously by the press, a symbol of intellectual justice. The headlines the next morning all carried the same message. A local paper ran the front-page title, Caleb Johnson, the boy who made justice speak through intellect. An international magazine published a lengthy commentary in which the author argued Caleb was not just a chess prodigy, but a representative of a young generation standing tall in the face of injustice. The story of a Maid's son who dared to sit down across from an arrogant millionaire and win had become an image that crossed all language boundaries, was translated into many languages, and featured in newspapers across Europe, Asia, and Africa. Inside the courtroom, Ruth Johnson quietly looked around as waves of applause filled the room. She held her son's hand, her face soaked with tears, but her eyes full of pride. For Ruth, praise was not the goal, but the protection Caleb had long deserved. Now she saw the entire community standing to applaud. Those who once stayed silent in the face of injustice, now collectively recognizing her son's intellect. That moment erased all the nights she held on to fear, believing that silence might bury the voices of the powerless. Amid the applause, Caleb showed no sign of smug. He sat calmly, holding his old chess book like a keepsake. When asked by a reporter how he felt being called a symbol of intellectual justice, Caleb gave a short reply. "I think anyone can be respected if they have the chance to prove themselves." That simple statement was widely shared, spreading just as powerfully as the video of the chess match. People praised not only his intellect, but also the humility of a boy far beyond his years, someone who had used quiet composure to teach society a lesson. Outside the courthouse, thousands gathered and cheered as the verdict was announced. Chants of "Justice for Caleb" rang out alongside clapping, flags and banners waving in the wind. The atmosphere felt like a justice celebration, where the people could finally witness the reversal they had long hoped for. A middle-aged woman in the crowd burst into tears when she saw Caleb step outside, telling a reporter, "We're satisfied because justice finally belonged to a child who was looked down on, and because now my own child can believe this society still has fairness." Social media continued to erupt. Images of the courtroom applauding in unison were shared with millions of likes and comments. Hashtags like #JusticeForCaleb, #SymbolOfJustice, and #Intellectual Fairness spread everywhere. Users posted their live reactions to the broadcast, many saying they had never seen a trial bring such a strong sense of relief and vindication. The mockery once aimed at Claudia and Brandt was replaced by tributes to Caleb, viewing him as proof that intellect can defeat arrogance, and quiet resolve can shake the very foundation's power. In post-trial analyses, many social experts emphasized that what mattered was not the amount of Claudia's fine, or the decision to demote Brandt, but the message society received. That message lived in Caleb's calm eyes, in Ruth's prideful grip on her son's hand, and in the thunderous applause from the public. It affirmed that truth, even when buried, will rise again, and when it does, it carries a force strong enough to make an entire society bow its head. On the evening news, final image that closed the broadcast showed Caleb walking out of the courthouse, clutching his chess book to his chest, Ruth beside him, surrounded by a crowd holding banners high. The anchor said, "That boy has become a symbol of intellectual justice, not just for winning a chess match, forcing us to face the truth." Those final words echoed in the hearts of millions of viewers, stirring public satisfaction not because the powerful had fallen, but because faith in justice had been reborn at the hands of a 12-year-old boy. After the groundbreaking trial, Caleb Johnson's name was no longer limited to local news reports. It had become an international topic. One of America's most prestigious magazines released a new issue with a cover photo of the 12-year-old boy, bright-eyed, clutching his worn chess book, alongside the bold headline, "The Chess Genius." The feature, spanning dozens of pages, recounted the journey from the son of a housemaid, pulled into a cruel prank, to the moment he became a symbol of intellectual justice. Sharp language and vivid imagery throughout the article helped global readers see Caleb not just as a young chess player, but as a model of persistence and dignity. That image spread quickly, shared by schools, chess clubs, and even social organizations. On social media, many teachers included the magazine cover in their lesson, calling Caleb proof that knowledge has nothing to do with background. A famous author wrote that the boy had turned the chessboard into a place where justice revealed itself, where arrogance bowed, and a small child rose. That kind of reach made Caleb's name a source of inspiration for millions, especially children who had once been underestimated because of their circumstances. In their modest apartment, Ruth Johnson quietly flipped through the magazine's pages, her eyes shining, though her hands trembled. She paused at the photo of her son seated at the chessboard, the light falling on his calm face, his eyes showing a maturity far beyond his years. Ruth smiled, a smile that held all the pride she had kept in through years of hard labor. She remembered the nights Caleb sat alone under the yellow light, reading that same old chessbook from the library over and over. Now that very image appeared on the cover of a major magazine, a sign that every quiet sacrifice she had made was not in vain. Despite the recognition, Caleb remained as composed as ever. When reporters came to his home to ask how he felt, he simply said, "I'm happy I get to do what I love. Chess teaches me that every move matters. Just like in life, if you're patient and think carefully, you'll find the right path." That simple line was quoted word for word in the article, earning even more admiration from the public. People saw that behind those calm eyes was a rare intellect, but also a humble spirit untouched by fame. Chess clubs around the world sent invitations for Caleb to join friendly competition. International grandmasters shared that they wanted to meet the boy who had stunned an entire society with one match. A renowned coach wrote, "It's not just talent, but the courage to face adversity that sets someone apart." Caleb didn't just win on the board, he won people's heart. Those reflections appeared widely in the press, reinforcing Caleb's image as a figure who transcended the world of sport. Ruth followed everything in silence, without showing off, without appearing much on camera. She chose to stand in the background, letting her son have the spotlight. But inside, pride surged like waves. She had once feared Caleb would always be looked down on because of his background, once believed her sweat and labor were only enough to keep him in school. Now, seeing her son praised by an international magazine, Ruth understood that life could be hard. Perseverance and love had opened a door she had never dared to dream of. The magazine sold out in just a few days, with bookstores having to reprint to meet demand. People bought it not only to read, but to keep as a memento of the moment when an ordinary boy rose to become a symbol. In working-class families, Caleb's story was retold as a lesson. If a child can rise up in hardship, then so can you. That kind of inspiration needed no heavy theory. Caleb's image alone was enough to shift the way society viewed things. As night fell, Ruth closed the magazine and set it beside the worn chessbook Caleb always carried. She smiled, saying nothing, but her eyes held a deep belief that her son was recognized not only for his talent but also honored for his quiet pride. In that silence, Ruth knew the road ahead would still be long. But today, Caleb had placed a brilliant marker, showing the world the true strength of intellect and dignity. When Caleb's image appeared on the magazine cover under the words, "The Chess Genius," Black communities everywhere saw it not only as recognition of one child's talent, but as a collective moment of pride. Many social activists called Caleb a spark of hope because, in their eyes, they saw the desire to rise beyond prejudice and the power to break the invisible walls endured by generations. Community meetings and online forums spoke of Caleb as a new symbol, proving that even in the lowest conditions, determination and intellect can shine. In inner-city schools, teachers hung his photo in classrooms, encouraging students with the words, "If Caleb could do it, so can you." Street corner conversation, coffee shop chat, church gathering, and community center discussions all centered around the boy's story. An elderly man who had lived through the civil rights movement told his friends with emotion, "I've seen many protests, but this is the first time a chess match shook the whole society." That boy reminded us that the fight against injustice takes many forms. Sometimes it's a voice, sometimes it's a move on the chessboard. Those words were passed along and shared online, making Caleb even more of a symbol of belief. In long-neglected neighborhoods, Black children began chatting excitedly about the prodigy boy. They formed small groups playing chess on sidewalks, using worn-out tables and makeshift chess pieces to reenact Caleb's famous move. A 10-year-old boy shouted after winning a match against his friend, "I want to be like Caleb. I want to show them I'm smart too." That line quickly became a symbol of newfound confidence, proving that this story was not just about one person, but had sparked a different spirit throughout the community. In the media, many people emphasized that one chess match changed everything. They weren't just referring to the downfall of Claudia's reputation or Brandt's loss of influence, but to a shift in how society viewed intelligence from marginalized backgrounds. A commentator on national television stressed, "Chess is a game of fairness. There's no rich or poor, only strategy and intellect." Caleb proved that to the world. That remark was quoted over and over as a perfect summary of the story. People talked non-stop at markets, on the streets, and in office spaces. A street vendor told customers she had watched the clip 10 times because every time she saw the boy make his final move, she felt stronger about facing her everyday life. An office worker wrote on her personal blog, "We've let arrogance dominate for too long, and now a child is teaching us that justice can come from the most unexpected place." These reflections appeared everywhere, each adding to the story, letting the echoes of the chess match spread further still. In political conversation, Caleb's case was used as an example of social inequality. A Black congressman spoke on the House floor saying, "Let us remember that a chess match made society look at itself. That That child didn't chant slogans or march in the street, but he made justice heard through calm resolve. The statement received loud applause, showing that Caleb had become a catalyst for many important discussions about fairness and opportunity. Meanwhile, Ruth remained her quietly humble self. She followed the news articles and television segments praising her son, but instead of basking in pride, she simply smiled to herself. For her, what mattered was not the title of genius or the bold headlines, but the fact that her son had brought hope to so many. As Caleb sat at the old wooden table, still studying the familiar chess position, Ruth knew he was the same boy he had always been. Only now, the light of his story had spread everywhere, warming the hearts of millions in search of hope. On quiet nights, Ruth often recalled the moment in the banquet hall where mocking laughter had once rained down on her and her son. She understood that if the video hadn't gone viral, the truth might have been buried. But now, hearing the community refer to Caleb as a spark of hope, hearing people repeat the phrase, "One chess match changed everything," she knew that history would not forget that moment. And in that belief, Ruth felt a deep sense of relief, knowing that her son had not only reclaimed respect for himself, but had opened a new chapter for those who had long been pushed to the margins of society. As the impact of the trial and the headlines about Caleb Johnson remained fresh, schools across the country quickly brought his story into their lesson, not as a fleeting headline, but as a vivid example of dignity, intellect, and youthful perseverance. In social studies classes, teachers played a short video showing the moment Caleb made the decisive move, then asked students for their thoughts. Many were first struck by his talent, but gradually realized the deeper meaning lay in his calm demeanor, steady gaze, and quiet strength in the face of humiliation. What used to be dry lessons turned into lively discussion, where students freely spoke about fairness, the right to be respected, and the true value of a person. In a high school classroom in New York, a teacher stood at the whiteboard, voice slow, firm. "This is proof that intellect transcends race." The room went silent for a few seconds, then hands began to rise. A black student shared that he felt more confident now, that he too could speak up when underestimated. A white student said she learned that arrogance built on privilege only blinds people. The teacher wrote down their reflections and shared them with the school board as proof Caleb's story had sparked a much-needed dialogue, helping young people see one another with more equal eye. Not only in the United States, but also in schools around the world, Caleb's name came up during lesson. At a school in England, a civics teacher projected the magazine cover showing the boy with the words, "The Chess Genius," explaining to students that this was a clear example of how intelligence can arise anywhere, unbound by class or background. In a classroom in South Africa, a teacher told the story with emotion, comparing Caleb's resolve to those who had fought for equality in his own country. Each retelling became a connecting thread, turning one boy's story into a global message. In Caleb's hometown, neighborhood kids began playing chess more often. Small clubs popped up on sidewalks, where old chessboards were set up and chipped plastic pieces were enough for them to imagine themselves in an important match. Adults passing by would often stop, smile, and say, "Remember Caleb, the boy who made the whole world listen." The children looked at each other, eyes bright with the belief they too could dream big dreams. Educators agreed that the most important thing wasn't Caleb being called a prodigy, but how his story affirmed the power of education and belief in oneself. Many academic articles were published, emphasizing that society must create opportunities for every child to be heard and to express their potential. Some universities even held symposiums under the theme "Intellect Beyond Barriers" to explore the wide-reaching impact Caleb had made. At parent-teacher meetings, many parents shared that their children had come home asking questions that made them stop and think, "If I were treated like Caleb, should I stand up for myself?" Those questions became the beginning of family conversations about respect and justice. People began to reconsider how they treated one another, from small words at home to behaviors in public. Step by step, the story didn't just stay in the classroom, it spread into every household, every family dinner table. That ripple effect reached even those who had once stayed silent in the face of injustice. Some of the guests at that banquet publicly apologized for not having the courage to speak up sooner. They said that when they saw Caleb sitting firmly at the chessboard, they realized silence can also be a form of complicity. These late confessions, reported by the press, became a social lesson that every individual carries responsibility in defending fairness. As the story found its way into education, it became more than a sensational news piece. It became a living curriculum for generations to come. Caleb Johnson, through his intellect and calm presence, stepped beyond the role of a boy playing chess to become a global source of educational inspiration. And in every classroom where his story was retold, justice no longer felt distant. It became a clear, relatable lesson lesson, planting in students' minds the belief that human dignity always matters and intelligence will always find a way to speak. At an educational conference held at the local high school, Ruth Johnson appeared for the first time before hundreds of teachers, students, and parents. She walked to the podium with steady steps, a firm gaze, and a voice that held its familiar warmth. Ruth looked down at the seat where Caleb sat, then at the eager faces awaiting her words. She didn't speak much about the pain she had endured or the humiliation of that banquet, but chose a simple sentence that said it all. One chess match is stronger than 1,000 words. The hall fell silent for a moment, because everyone knew those words were not just for her son, but for all who had ever felt dismissed. Ruth explained that the chessboard that night wasn't just a game. It was a place where a child used intellect to confront arrogance, and where society was forced to listen. She spoke of the nights Caleb sat under a dim light, absorbed in his old book, and affirmed that strength doesn't have to come from power or status, from persistence and belief in oneself. As she spoke, Ruth's voice was steady, both sharing and guiding, so that every student in the hall could see they too could find strength within themselves. Ruth's words quickly became the center of attention, quoted by reporters that very evening. "One chess match is stronger than 1,000 words," appeared on television broadcasts, in newspaper headlines, and across personal posts spreading on social media. People said the phrase captured the entire story, that sometimes a quiet, steadfast act can replace even the longest speeches. For many, it was no longer just a mother's remark, but a statement for an entire generation. When Ruth finished her speech, the atmosphere in the auditorium surged. Dozens of students stood up, loud applause filling the room, not just to thank her, but to show agreement. Young faces lit up with emotion, some wiping away tears, others looking to their friends with renewed resolve. A few teachers couldn't hide proud smile, having seen their own students gain new confidence. That moment turned the auditorium into a grand stage where justice and inspiration spread more powerfully than ever. Caleb sat in the front row, quietly watching his mother. He didn't stand to speak, and he didn't need to. His presence alone was the answer. As his classmates clapped non-stop, Caleb's eyes shone, calm as ever, as if he had always known that action could speak louder than words. After the event, a few students came up to shake his hand, telling him he had helped them believe that intelligence isn't limited by skin color or circumstance. Caleb only smiled, holding his old chess book in his arm, and that image was once again captured and shared everywhere. Teachers who attended the event all noted a visible shift in student spirit. They saw many begin to take an interest in chess, join intellectual clubs, and, more importantly, learn how to stand tall when dismissed. One teacher told the press that the lesson of Caleb went far beyond the mat. It was a lesson in courage. He emphasized that Ruth's statement, "One chess match is stronger than 1,000 words," would become a motto for future generations. Outside the auditorium, parents and students continued their excited conversation. Many snapped pictures of Ruth at the podium, sharing them with captions like, "The mother who spoke for all of us." That line was shared thousands of times, turning her words into the slogan of a broader social movement. That night, international media outlets also quoted her, framing it as a reminder to humanity of the value of intellectual justice. In their small apartment, as the attention began to quiet, Ruth still wore a peaceful smile. She knew her son had not only claimed justice for himself, but had sparked hope for an entire community. The words she had spoken, almost unintentionally, had become the flame that carried Caleb's story even further, from classrooms into society. And as she looked at her son holding that old book, Ruth understood that one chess match had truly changed everything. Not because of victory or defeat, but because it awakened the strength hidden in millions of people. Public pressure and legal judgments had pushed Claudia Vexler to the edge. After days of silence and empty attempts at deflection, she was finally forced to appear at a live broadcast press conference. The room was packed with reporters, cameras pointed at her every move, the bright lights leaving no room for concealment. As she stepped up to the podium, Claudia wore her usual elegant appearance, but her eyes looked lost, and her hands trembled as they clutched a stack of papers. Facing millions of viewers on screen, she had to do something she once considered unthinkable: publicly bow her head in apology. Her voice shook at first as she tried to remain composed. "I apologize for the words and actions at the banquet. I was wrong to let arrogance blind me and to insult a child." The words sounded carefully rehearsed, but when spoken, they felt stiff, lacking sincerity. Claudia bowed her head, yet the reluctance in her eyes was clear. Reporters immediately swarmed her with pointed questions. "Are you apologizing out of fear of public backlash or out of genuine remorse? Do you believe a belated apology can make up for the humiliation Caleb and his mother endured?" Each question landed like an arrow, and Claudia grew visibly flustered, her eyes darting in search of an escape. The entire scene aired live. Millions of viewers watched her shaken expression, witnessing the stark contrast between the once powerful Claudia, who had strutted into the banquet hall with pride, and the Claudia now, standing before the public, trembling. Apologies were spoken, but her vacant gaze suggested she didn't believe the words herself. That disconnect only deepened public anger, and social media exploded with commentary. Too late. This isn't remorse, it's damage control. The media quickly dissected the event. Some commentators called it a necessary step to close the case, but most agreed that Claudia's unwilling attitude turned the apology into a double-edged sword. Editorials pointed out that her public bow was not a voluntary act, but one forced by public outcry and legal pressure. The image of her looking down on live television became a symbol of the downfall of a once untouchable figure. Meanwhile, the community's reaction was intense. Some people openly stated that they didn't need an apology because the insult had been too blatant and irreversible. The public viewed the moment as proof false power must eventually yield to truth. The hashtag number sign, "Too Late Apology," spread across social media, accompanied by close-up photos of Claudia's empty stare during the speech. Mockery overtook the narrative, turning the apology into a public spectacle rather than an act of redemption. Ruth and Caleb did not attend the press conference, but the image of Claudia bowing her head reached them through the evening news. Ruth looked at the screen in silence for a long time, then simply sighed. A belated apology doesn't change the truth, but at least it proves my son made them bow. Caleb sat beside her, still holding his chessbook, nodding slightly, as if the event itself mattered less than proving his worth. To him, the core message wasn't public remorse, but the lesson that justice can force even the most arrogant to listen. When the broadcast ended, news channels immediately replayed the key footage. Claudia bowing, her eyes vacant, camera shutters flashing. The scene was compared to the moment Caleb calmly made his final move in the banquet hall, like two opposing extremes. On one side, the composure of intellect, on the other, the unraveling of arrogance when defeated. The public didn't absorb the image to forgive, but to remember that every act of humiliation comes with a price. And however late, a public bow marked the end of Claudia's false glory. After the apology, Claudia Vexler disappeared from public events, but the image of her bowing remained, a vivid reminder that public pressure and justice can force even the proudest to stand before the world and admit they were wrong. In that silence, people didn't remember Claudia's clumsy word. They remembered the lost look in her eye, reflecting the fall of a figure who once believed herself untouchable. Immediately after the broadcast, social media was flooded with images of Claudia bowing, her vacant stare captured from every angle. Millions of comments appeared within hours, most sharing the same cold message: too late for regret. People no longer sought explanations or excuses. They saw the moment as the inevitable downfall of someone who had lived in arrogance. On television, commentators emphasized that Claudia was not truly remorseful, but simply forced to act to salvage what reputation remained. The public's coldness did not stem from hatred, but from the belief that a forced apology has no meaning when the wound runs too deep. Mocking images spread quick, from short clips of Claudia bowing, close-up shots of her flustered face as she answered questions. People captioned them with lines like, "Not remorse, just defeat," and shared them millions of times. Late-night programs buzzed with discussion, one guest saying plainly, "An apology doesn't erase humiliation. It just proves she had no choice but to bow to the truth." That bluntness reflected society's stance, where public opinion decided forgiveness could not be handed out easily, especially when the one who caused the pain had never truly understood the damage they had done. In cafes, on buses, in offices, the story of the apology became the main topic of conversation. A middle-aged man shook his head and told his friend, "If it weren't for the video, there wouldn't be any apology at all." A woman added, "Remorse only matters when it comes from the heart." This was just a performance in front of the camera. Those simple remarks echoed everywhere, reinforcing public consensus that Claudia's apology changed nothing except to deepen the sense of betrayal. While the community surged with cold reactions, Caleb chose silence. The boy sat in his small room, warm yellow light spilling onto the wooden table, the old chessbook resting in his hand. When a reporter asked what he thought about the public apology, Caleb simply shook his head. No criticism, no comment, just the calm silence of a 12-year-old. That gentle but firm shake spoke louder than any statement, showing he didn't need a belated apology to validate his worth. Ruth sat beside him, looking at her son, and knowing that his calm was not indifferent, but his way of holding on to dignity. She didn't urge him to speak or express anything, because she knew the most important thing had already happened. Justice had been seen, truth acknowledged. Caleb didn't need an apology to prove his victory, because his silence itself was a declaration. Many journalists who witnessed that moment wrote, "Caleb's headshake was the harshest verdict. It gave Claudia no room for redemption." Sociologists analyzed that Caleb's silence carried more weight than any accusation. It turned the story into a lesson that forgiveness doesn't always require word. Sometimes, silence is proof that the victim no longer needs to acknowledge the one who caused the harm. On social media, many shared the video of Caleb shaking his head, calling it a symbol of self-respect. The hashtag #headshake of truth appeared and quickly became a global trend. The public drew comparisons between two opposing images, Claudia's reluctant bow and Caleb's calm headshake. One showed the fall of power under pressure, the other, the quiet pride of intellect standing firm without compromise. That contrast deepened the impact of their confrontation, convincing many that it was Caleb's response that lifted the story beyond a personal case. It became a symbol of justice. That night, the television broadcast ended with a split-screen image, Claudia under camera light, her eyes vacant, and Caleb in his small room, gently shaking his head. The anchor said, "A belated apology may save faith, but it cannot reclaim respect. And sometimes, the silence of a child is enough to remind society justice does not need negotiation." Those closing words echoed, leaving millions of viewers in silence, each of them understanding that this story ended not with forgiveness, but with an undeniable truth. After all the aftershocks of the incident, the name Caleb Johnson was no longer confined to a courtroom or a sensational news story. In the days that followed, an entirely new door opened before the boy and his family. The International Chess Federation officially sent Caleb an invitation to participate in a major tournament gathering young talents from around the world. The news quickly spread through the media, moving many who reflected on the journey of a boy once made into a joke, now stepping into the most prestigious arena of intellect. For Caleb, the invitation was not only an honor, but a recognition that his passion for chess was finally being taken seriously. The day they received the letter, Ruth sat at the small wooden table in their modest apartment, eyes brimming as she read each line. She remembered the moment in the lavish banquet hall when her son had been dragged out as a source of entertainment. Now that same boy was being respectfully called upon by an international organization, not to be humiliated, but to be given a chance. Ruth looked at Caleb, saw him holding his old chessbook, his eyes calm yet deep, and she knew he was ready for a new journey. She gently placed a hand on his shoulder, her eyes filled with pride, as if to say that every past hardship had now been answered. Caleb didn't cheer when he heard the news, nor did he show any self-satisfaction. He simply nodded and told his mother, "I'll do my best." It was a short sentence, but for Ruth, it echoed louder than any promise. Her boy understood that this tournament was no game. It was a chance to prove his ability in front of the most critical eyes. More importantly, it was an opportunity to show that intellect can break every barrier, that a child from a working-class background can step into a space long believed to belong only to the privileged. International media outlets covered the story widely. Major newspapers published photos of Caleb with captions like, "From cruel mockery to global voice of intellect." Chess experts discussed how his participation would not only create exciting matchups, but also carry significant social meaning. A renowned commentator said on live television, "Caleb proves his skill on the global stage. It won't just be a personal victory. It will be a message to younger generations that circumstance cannot limit intellect." These remarks only fueled public anticipation for the day Caleb would compete. Within the Black community, the event was seen as a collective triumph. People held community gathering, projected Caleb's image on large screen, and chanted that, "This is the torch of hope." Children in the neighborhood started practicing chess more, inspired by the journey of someone their age. A 10-year-old boy smiled and said to his friend, "If Caleb can do it, I can too." That belief spread like a powerful current, transforming the heavy atmosphere in neighborhoods where people rarely believed they could reach a global stage. Ruth accompanied her son through every step of preparation. She knew he was strong, but in her eyes, Caleb was still just a 12-year-old boy. She worried about his health, about the pressure he would face, but at the same time, she was prouder than ever. Every time she saw Caleb focused on the chessboard, Ruth clearly saw a maturity beyond his years. She quietly packed their bag, saved every penny to make sure the two of them could attend the tournament under the best conditions possible. In every motion, folding clothes, carefully placing the old chessbook into the suitcase, Ruth felt she was contributing a small part to her son's great journey. On the day of departure, the airport was crowded with reporters and fans. Caleb walked calmly through the crowd, while Ruth walked beside him, her eyes glowing with pride. She didn't need to speak or hold a sign. She simply held her son's hand tightly to show the world that this boy was never alone. Cameras captured that moment, and the image of mother and son hand in hand quickly became a new symbol. A symbol of motherhood, of resilience, and of an intellectual journey reaching the world stage. On the flight, Ruth quietly watched her son reading. The boy seemed unaware of the noise around him, focused only on the worn pages that had been with him since the very beginning. Ruth smiled gently, feeling peace in her heart. She knew that no matter the tournament's outcome, Caleb had already won because he had proven that truth and intellect could prevail against even the most arrogant forces. The journey was only beginning, but it already carried the hopes and beliefs of millions. In the days leading up to the tournament, the media continuously updated footage of Caleb training. Special features showed him seated across from from much older opponents, maintaining his calm demeanor, his eyes glowing as he calculated each move. Commentators noted that his composure was Caleb's greatest strength, the very quality that had once silenced a grand banquet hall. Now, it remained his weapon as he stepped onto the global stage. The community followed every step, sending wishes, writing letters of encouragement, drawing pictures of the prodigy boy. Letters from all over the world poured into the small apartment, filled with sincere words of support. Ruth read each one, then carefully placed them in a box to give to Caleb later as a gift of the Spirit. She believed those words would become the fuel her son needed to move forward on the road ahead. Caleb's new journey was not just an international tournament. It was proof intellect can break down all prejudice, that a once mocked child could become a face celebrated by the world. And with every step he took, Ruth was there too, the proud mother walking beside him, carrying the belief that her son wasn't just playing a game of chess. He was continuing the story of justice and dignity for an entire generation. As Caleb Johnson prepared for the International Chess Tournament, global media continued to celebrate his story. A major newspaper ran a full-page headline, "From Maid's son to prodigy," accompanied by an image of the 12-year-old boy sitting upright, his hand resting gently on a chess, eyes glowing focus. That headline highlighted not just his talent, but the difficult journey behind it. From the son of a housemaid, Caleb had risen to become a symbol of hope and justice. Article after article analyzed each turning point in his life, from the moment he was dragged out as a joke, to the move that ended the match in the banquet hall, and now, to global recognition. Readers followed not just for the news, but to draw inspiration from the idea that the road to intellect and dignity can begin at the very bottom, yet still lead to the highest peak. A wave of special features was produced. International television networks replayed the footage of the pivotal chess match, intercut with scenes of Caleb training hard for the upcoming tournament. Anchors spoke deep emotion. This is a remarkable reversal, where the arrogance of the elite was defeated by the clear-sighted intellect of a child. Viewers watched and reacted in droves, many admitting they had never seen someone evoke such sympathy and admiration at once. The phrase, "from Maid's son to prodigy," quickly became a slogan, appearing across social media, on signs of support, and even printed on t-shirts to rally encouragement for Caleb ahead of the competition. In the small apartment, Caleb kept to his usual habits. Though his name was now known around the world, the boy still sat at the familiar wooden table, as focused as he was when first learning the game. The worn book lay by his side, the scratched plastic chess pieces neatly arranged. He looked at the board as if it were a vast universe, each move a star, each strategy its own sky. His eyes lit up, not because glory was near, but because of a sincere love for the game that had been with him since childhood. His small hands moved the pieces with precision, his face calm, not tense, quietly focused. Caleb, sitting before the chessboard, never felt old. It always felt like the first time, filled with eagerness and respect. Ruth sat nearby, observing her son's every move. She knew the world outside was calling Caleb's name, but in this room, he was still just a child who loved chess. Her eyes shone with pride, but also with emotion, seeing that her son had kept his innocence intact amid the media storm. Ruth understood that this calmness was the key to Caleb's strength. She remembered the hard years of labor, never imagining her son would one day be at the center of international attention. But now, watching him sit there, focused on the board with pure passion, she realized the most precious thing he possessed was not fame, but a spirit untouched by the spotlight. Journalists who came to interview were all surprised to see that Caleb had not changed. One reporter noted, "We came to meet a prodigy, but in front of us was just a humble boy, focused on an old chessboard as if the outside world didn't exist." That article was quickly shared widely, making Caleb's image even more remarkable, a genius who remained grounded. The contrast between the media spotlight and the small space where Caleb practiced moved the public, reminding them that every great victory begins in the most ordinary moment. Press didn't just praise his talent, they also explored the human side of his story. One article analyzed, "From Maid's son to prodigy," isn't just a story about a kid who plays chess well, it's a lesson for society. It reminds us that every individual has value, no matter their background. It affirms that intellect and fairness can grow in places few would expect. That piece was shared everywhere, becoming a point of discussion that many schools included in their curriculum to help students understand that success doesn't come from privilege, from patience and belief. In the days leading up to the tournament, Caleb was seen in intensive training sessions with much older opponents. Yet wherever he was, he maintained the same focus as when sitting alone at the small wooden table. That presence surprised many grandmasters, who remarked Caleb's calmness was a strength few possess. One international coach said, "His opponents aren't just those across the board, it's the pressure of millions of eyes watching, but this boy has learned to beat pressure before he beats people. The black community continued to see Caleb as a symbol. They were proud not just of his achievements, but of what his image represented, the belief that the next generation could break barriers. Online forums buzzed with comments like, "Caleb sits at the chessboard as if it's the first time, but really, he's sitting in front of history. Every move he makes is a step forward for the whole community." These comments spread widely, pushing the story beyond the realm of sport, turning it into a discourse about dignity and justice. Ruth watched her son quietly focus, knowing the challenge ahead was immense. But she believed Caleb had the strength to face it. In her proud eyes was a conviction that this journey was no longer just a path for one child, but a journey for an entire community in search of justice and hope. And as Caleb sat there, focused as if it were his first game, the world outside became only a distant echo, because in the boy's mind, the chessboard remained a pure universe, where intellect leads the way and justice is written one move at a time. The story began with a cruel joke at a lavish party, where a boy was pulled out as entertainment before the powerful. But over time, from tears and mocking laughter, that very chess match became a symbol of justice and dignity. Caleb Johnson, with his small hands and calm gaze, proved that intellect is not defined by background, and the arrogance of power cannot overshadow real worth. People no longer speak of Claudia as a glamorous millionaire, or Brandt as an authoritative officer, but of Caleb, the child who made society stop and reflect. From what seemed like a harmless game, the story became a mirror reflecting injustice, and a reminder that justice can appear in the most unexpected ways. Throughout the journey, the public witnessed a boy face ridicule and scornful stares without fear. The moves he made quietly defeated prejudice, without shouting, without revenge. As public attention surged and hashtags spread across social media, the story was no longer just Caleb, but belonged to millions who had once been overlooked, forced into silence. The boy unintentionally became a spark, lighting the belief that human dignity can be protected, and truth will always find a way to rise. In a conversation after the trial, Ruth Johnson was asked what message she hoped to leave behind. She sat upright, her voice warm but firm. "No one has the right to define our worth." The words were simple, carried a force that moved many. Ruth had lived through hard years, worked quietly in the shadows, and watched her son be made a joke. But now, she could say those words with pride, knowing that justice had stood on her side. It was not a statement to close a case, but a reminder to all. Dignity belongs to each individual, and no one has the right to take it away. From a social perspective, Caleb's story sparked changes beyond expectation. Schools included it in their lesson, and human rights organizations used it to advocate against class and racial discrimination. In many places, children were encouraged to stand up for themselves, while adults learned to see each other with more respect. This ripple effect made Caleb's chess match not just a memory, but a symbol, a milestone reminding society that justice is not out of reach, but a value that must be nurtured every day. Caleb, after everything, remained as calm as ever. He did not need praise to validate himself, because he understood that true strength lies in living with passion and dignity. The image of him sitting at the chessboard, focused as if for the first time, spoke louder than any word. And Ruth, the mother who always stood behind, could now smile quietly, knowing her son had not only won, but had given an entire community something to believe in. And so, from a cruel joke, the story ended with an affirmation of justice. A chess match, once seen as mere entertainment at a party, became a bell that awakened society's conscience. It served as a reminder that while power can be earned, intellect and dignity are values that cannot be buried. And each time the story is retold, Ruth's words echo like a legacy. No one has the right to define our worth. After all the upheaval, society reached a rare consensus. No more heated debate, no more justifications for toppled arrogance. The public unanimously accepted a simple truth. Intellect knows no class or color. From bustling city neighborhoods to remote villages, people recalled Caleb's story as a living example of that belief. Some newspapers wrote that the match was not just a victory for one boy, but for an entire community, long trampled by prejudice. Sociology forum, television programs, and even university lectures analyzed the case as proof human value should never be limited by birth. In daily conversations, people spoke of the story with warmth in their eyes. A father took his son to a bookstore, pointed to a magazine cover featuring Caleb, and said, "Remember, it doesn't matter where you come from. What matters is believing in yourself." At a cafe, a group of young people chatted excitedly, and one girl said, "If a boy who was called out as a joke can become a symbol of justice, then we can change the bias around us too." Those words spread, turning the story from a single incident into a force that inspired thousands. Social organizations quickly embraced that spirit. They featured Caleb's image in educational campaigns, using his story as a mirror to emphasize that every child deserves encouragement. A scholarship fund was launched, named Head Held High, to support students from difficult backgrounds who demonstrate talent talent and determination. At the launch event, the foundation's director said this was their way of carrying forward Caleb's lesson, that intellect should never be wasted because of social barriers. Hundreds of low-income families signed their children up, and those very children would become the next generation, carry the story of the boy who once sat at a chessboard and changed an entire community. International media continued to cover the story, but this time it went beyond mere reporting. They called it Caleb, a social phenomenon, proving that an ordinary individual can spark collective belief. Researchers analyzed that the public is ready to offer strong support when a story embodies both justice and humanity. In this case, Caleb represented not only chess talent, but also the aspiration for justice beyond borders. A French scholar wrote, "Sometimes great change doesn't begin in parliaments or boardrooms, but with a child who dares to lift his head." Caleb, amid the whirlwind of praise, remained calm. In interviews, he sat upright, speaking slowly, not using many words, but every sentence was firm. When a journalist asked what he thought about becoming a symbol, Caleb simply replied, "I think people saw clearly that fairness is something everyone needs." The statement was short, carried a depth that made many adults reflect. He didn't try to become a speaker, nor did he seek the spotlight, letting his simplicity speak for itself. Ruth, the mother who once quietly held her son in the corner of a party, could now smile as she listened to his words. She knew her son had not only kept his innocence, but was steady enough to walk through scrutiny. In her heart, pride didn't need to be voiced, because Caleb's gaze had answered for her. And as she witnessed the public unanimously agree that intellect rises above all prejudice, Ruth felt that her years of hardship had become a strength that now nourished an entire generation. The final image etched in many people's memory was Caleb's eye as he ended a long day, sitting quietly before the familiar chessboard. He lifted a piece, placed it down, then looked up into the distance, his gaze calm yet profound. In that look, people saw the whole journey, from a child mocked to the boy who made a millionaire bow, to a prodigy stepping into the world. That gaze seemed to say that justice sometimes begins with a child who dares to raise their head, someone who refuses to be diminished, someone who holds firm even in the smallest moment. People recalled that gaze in conversation, seeing it as the image captured the entire story. A philosophy professor stated on television, "We often think justice comes from great institutions, but sometimes it begins with a simple act. When a child decides not to lower their head before contempt." Those words echoed widely, affirming that Caleb's lesson is not only for today, but for the future. And so, when Caleb's gaze closed in a moment of calm, it did not mark the end of a story, but the beginning of countless others. That boy left society with a simple yet powerful lesson: dignity cannot be taken away. Intelligence is not limited by skin color or status, and justice can begin in the clear eyes of a child who dares to look injustice straight on. From that moment, the story of Caleb Johnson will be retold many times, as proof that sometimes, to change the world, all it takes is to keep your eyes from looking down. The story of Caleb Johnson began at a glamorous party where power and wealth seemed to overshadow everything. Beneath sparkling chandeliers, amid laughter and the arrogance of the elite, a 12-year-old boy was called out merely to be a source of amusement. Claudia Vexler, a woman holding vast wealth, and Officer Brandt, a man representing the strength of the system, believed they could corner a child and turn him into a joke. Yet that seemingly small moment marked a turning point for an entire community, and from a cruel prank, the world witnessed the birth of a symbol of intellectual justice. Caleb approached the chessboard not as someone forced into place, but with rare composure. His eyes glowed, his small hand placed each piece with the certainty of someone who deeply understood the game. Every move shifted the atmosphere in the grand hall, from mockery to amazement, from ridicule to heavy silence. The voices of contempt could no longer drown out the truth unfolding before them. Intelligence can come from anywhere, even from the places most dismissed. That match ended in complete victory. But more importantly, it signaled the collapse of false privilege and the rise of dignity. From the lavish hall, the story quickly spilled into society. The video of the match spread at lightning speed, turning Caleb into the center of attention. The public saw not just a boy skilled at chess, but a human lesson. When truth is exposed, even a system long dependent on silence must confront it. Millions voiced the same message, that intelligence has no color, no class distinction, and that mocking a child to diminish them is a stain society must never tolerate. Public pressure rapidly mounted against Claudia and Brandt. Their justifications only fueled more outrage. Video evidence, along with expert analysis, confirmed that Caleb was a true prodigy and that the humiliation he suffered was a public offense. Claudia lost credibility. Business contracts were withdrawn, and her arrogance turned into a burden. Brandt was suspended and later demoted. The image of him tapping his baton to threaten a child became proof of abuse of power. The two, once confident they could control the story through their position, became lasting symbols of downfall. Meanwhile, Caleb sought neither revenge nor praise. He returned to his chessboard, spending hours with his old book, maintaining humility and focus. Ruth Johnson, the mother who once swallowed her pride to raise her son, could now lift her head and face the world, her eyes filled with pride. She didn't need titles for herself, only that her son be respected. When Ruth said during a seminar, "A single chess match can be stronger than 1,000 words," the entire room stood in applause, because the sentence captured perfectly the power of truth. A steady action can echo louder than any speech. The story didn't end with applause or hashtag. It spread as inspiration in classrooms, where teachers shared Caleb's journey to show students that intelligence is not bound by background. It appeared in international forums, where people discussed social justice and the responsibility to protect the vulnerable. It entered daily life, where children set up plastic chessboards on sidewalks, telling themselves that if Caleb could do it, so could they. A personal story became a collective movement, rekindling belief in fairness. Claudia's late apology, broadcast live on television, made the contrast even clearer. Her lost gaze and trembling voice revealed it was a forced gesture, not genuine remorse. The public responded coldly, too late for regret. While Claudia tried to salvage her reputation, Caleb simply shook his head. That silence, calm yet firm, became the most powerful judgment. It said, without words, that his worth had never depended on validation from those who denied human dignity. When Caleb received the invitation to an international tournament, the public rejoiced, not out of curiosity, but because they saw justice opening a new path. From a boy humiliated at a party, Caleb stepped into the world with intelligence and resolve. The headlines read, "From Maid son to prodigy," but he remained at the chessboard as if it were his first time, focused and humble. Ruth walked beside him, eyes proud, knowing her son was no longer just her child, but a symbol for every community once looked down upon. Looking back on the entire story, what moves people most is not just the victory on the board, but the journey of dignity. Caleb showed that a child can make an entire society reflect. Justice can begin with quiet strength, a gaze that refuses to lower. His story reminds us that truth always finds a way to be heard, and that intelligence is never limited by status or skin color. The greatest lesson left behind is Ruth's own word. No one has the right to define our worth. In a world still shaped by bias and division, once someone dares to lift their head and hold on to self-belief, justice will find its way. Caleb opened the door for all to see that dignity cannot be buried, intelligence cannot be denied, and fairness is never just a distant dream. Today, when the story is recalled, people no longer remember the extravagance of the party or the mocking laughter at the start, but the gaze of the 12-year-old boy as he sat before the chessboard. That gaze was calm, yet radiant, filled with pride and determination. It became a symbol of courage, a reminder that even in adversity, a child can rewrite the story of justice for an entire society. And in that gaze, the world found faith that sometimes, to change everything, all it takes is one child brave enough to lift their head.